Hello, everyone, and welcome to Brazil 2021 in Debate. I am Clara Sodré, I'm the advisor for investments at XP Investimentos, and here we have Raquel de Sá. She's a macroeconomy analyst at XP Investments. Hello, Raquel. Hello, Clara. How's it going? I'm happy to be here at this event. We will be discussing some perspectives for this year that's starting off, the year 2021. After such a busy and crazy year. So this makes this platform, we're doing this online and it's such a different reality, but we have to adapt to this new reality. The question is what to expect from the next year in the economic, political, and investments fields after the avalanche caused by COVID-19. 2019. What were the main impacts in our country, and what are the main leverages that will help us to go resume growth? Well, these are the questions that are worth $1 million, and all of those questions that everyone's asking us. But besides bringing some specialists to discuss these issues that are so important for the next year, amidst all of this. So now let's focus on some forecasts, talking about growth, talking about perspectives with panels that are filled with specialists. And tomorrow we will have a day focused on investments. Today we are talking about some panoramas of our economy. And in this agenda today, we will have the economic policy for 2021 and up ahead, the big tax reform and a vision for Brazil. Please follow along and hang in with us because these topics can help you a lot with your next steps as an investor. As we talk about our next steps, we have some forecasts. Well, I think the technical failure happened right when you asked about the failures and forecasts, because everyone's afraid of forecasts, right? And let's see what the specialists are going to say when it comes to forecasts, and if their connection's also going to drop when they talk about this forecast for growth in the GDP. So to talk about this a little more, we have what we call some of my opinions. Um, uh, it's an opinion, of course, after such a complex year as this one. So we're leaving from a completely different year, a very unique crisis, and a year that no one can understand this unprecedented year. So I think that it seems like we've almost gotten used to these forecasts and short term really surprising us, and next year we'll have a lot more challenges for Brazil and for the world. But without giving you further spoilers from our forecast here at the XP Investments team, I would like to call our first panelist that will talk about this, what to expect from economy and politics, because we can never separate these two main elements, especially in a year like this in 2021. And that's why I would like to invite our chief economist, Caio Megali. Welcome, Caio Megali. Hello, Clara and Raquel. Thank you so much for this invitation. Thank you for this presentation. Good evening. Good evening. Now we will also invite our second expert here from XP for politics, which is our political analysis chief here at XP Investments.
Raquel e Clara, Caio, boa noite, obrigado a todos que nos assistem
Hello,
hoje aqui,
Richard Beck.
obrigado pelo convite.
Good
Esse aqui
evening.
é
Thank
2001,
you for this
parece, né, Raquel?
invitation.
Mas cede o espaço, porque tá
Things
feia
are
a
so
coisa.
tough.
Tá, mas obrigado aí.
We will also have the presence of Deborah Santos, our analyst, political analyst here at XP Investments, that will also help us to see a very specialized perspective and with a lot of details straight from Brasilia. Welcome, Deborah.
Boa noite, pessoal.
Good evening,
Boa
everyone.
tarde, quase
Good
boa noite.
afternoon,
Obrigada
almost
a
good
todos
evening.
pelo convite. Obrigada,
Thank
Raquel,
you for this
Clara.
invitation. Thank
É
you,
um
Raquel
prazer
and
estar
Clara.
aqui com
It's
o
a pleasure
Caio
to
e com
be
o
here with
Richard, esses dois
Caio and Richard as
craques,
well. These are
para a
two
gente
major
discutir,
specialists here,
enfim, um
so
assunto, um
that we
tema
can
fácil, um
discuss
tema
a
tranquilo. O que,
topic
que vem aí para
of what's coming
2021?
up
Um ano com
ahead, right?
poucas
It's not a
incertezas, não é
simple,
mesmo?
easy
Bom, contém ironia
question,
nessa
right? There's
fala.
a lot of
Vamos dar uma olhada na nossa
irony in
vinheta
this
antes da
speech.
gente
So
começar,
let's
pessoal?
take a look at our vignette before we begin, all right?
Boa noite de novo,
Good
pessoal. É
evening.
um prazer estar aqui com
It's a
vocês.
pleasure to
Muito
be
obrigada
here.
pela audiência de
Thank you
vocês
so
e
much for your presence
muitíssimo
here,
obrigada
and thank you
pelo
so
convite
much
para a gente
for
estar
this
aqui tocando
invitation to be here,
essa discussão
leading
tão
this
importante
discussion that is so
para o
important
mercado. Não dá
for
mais
the
no Brasil para a
market.
gente falar
In
sobre
Brazil, we cannot
economia
talk about
dissociado da política e muito pouco sobre
economics
política
separately
dissociado
from
da
politics.
economia. Eu queria
And
iniciar essa conversa
I would like to
sobre
start
o
off
que
this
esperar para
question,
2021, chamando o Caio Megali para falar de
and I would
dos
like to invite
maiores
Caio
desafios
Megali to talk
que
about
o
one of the
país
biggest
tem
challenges that the country will face
enfrentado em
and
2020
has
e
been
acho que vai
facing in
enfrentar
2020,
ainda
and
em
I believe will
2021,
face as well
que
in
é
2021,
a
which
questão
is
fiscal e o
the
oceano
fiscal
de
matter
incertezas
and the
fiscais que a
ocean
gente
of
tem
uncertainties, fiscal uncertainties
navegado,
we
né,
have
Caio?
been
Obrigada.
navigating through. Thank you, Caio. Thank you, Deborah. Once again, good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to be participating in this event and trying to understand a bit about the economy in Brazil will look like next year. This year was completely atypical, and this provides us with some questions and also some hopes for next year. And I would like to quickly talk about some of these topics and what we are considering for the scenario up front. I think the main topic is the growth topic. And Brazil has been recovering quickly ever since the more acute process of the pandemic. But we know that a lot of this recovery is also leveraged and propelled by the Corona voucher and all of the other programs that the government implemented to support the economy. But the question is when we have to end these social support programs, and they were created to last throughout 2020, right? And this is actually in the constitutional amendment, the PEC da Guerra, the war constitutional amendment that says, look, temporarily expenses related to COVID can be out of the fiscal rules. But then from 2021, things are going to get back into the structure of the questions. So this is in the Constitution, and we have to respect this. We know that, but as you mentioned, that this fiscal scenario up ahead for public accounts is very difficult. Brazil was already in under a very intense debt situation, and so we have a very complicated challenge, and we have to provide some signs that we will be able to pay this debt level up in the future. So since we have some deficits, we need the market to lend the government resources to be able to fund its expenses. So to be able to pay for these expenses, you have to represent some signs that this debt will be able to be paid in some time. So with the Corona vouchers and other government support finishing, what will compensate or offset this growth in the economy? I think this is the first question mark for next year. Is this growth that we're seeing going to be sustainable? There's two reasons that make me believe that a good part of this drop in the Corona voucher will be compensated. First of all, the interests are low. They're about 2%, and considering the inflation of about 3 or 4%, the real interest. So this supports the credit market and should leverage some different sectors with the sale of vehicles, real estate, and construction overall. The second point is that we are seeing the labor market also become normalized. So as the economy is reopened, those job positions are going to resume. So now you see a football team, for example, and there's no uh, cheerleaders, but when the vaccine comes back and you have all those people that are involved and working in the stadium, for example, in a game, will get back to their jobs. So it's the same thing for the event sectors, for the tourism sectors, for international traveling sectors. So as the economy is reopened, they're going to be resuming their jobs. But of course, this second wave of COVID is concerning, and we don't know how this transition will take place until we have the vaccine. But throughout 2021, this should be an important leverage. So we are carefully optimistic about this growth up ahead. We believe that the economy will continue to expand, although at levels that are a bit slower than these. So I think this is the first topic. The second topic is the inflation. The inflation went up in the second semester, and we had a lot of expenses with these government programs that were transferred to expenses with construction material, furniture, electronics, home appliances, food items, and staples and cleaning supplies. So there was a very big concentrated demand in these kind of products that continued to work well during the pandemic. A lot of things closed and a lot of things continued to work well, but prices went up. Besides this, the world's been moving ahead pretty well. China's been recovering very well. The US has also gone through this most uncertainty filled spot with the elections. But with the whole world kind of growing and resuming growing, the prices of raw materials and grains, soy, and corn will also go up, and this will bring in an inflation. So we're seeing inflation of like 1.5 to 2, reaching almost 6% in the middle of next year. So this is a pretty big ramp up of growth in the inflation. What we're seeing is kind of like this curve. We think it's going to reach a peak and then it's going to go down. So why? Because since the economy will grow less and these kind of shocks with the inflation will have a very strong connection with the pandemic. As the economy will be a little more normalized, the inflation should drop. So I think that even with the inflation up, the central bank won't increase interest rates till the middle of next year. But this kind of curve in the inflation is also a question mark, because as the inflation grows, the expectations for inflation continue to grow, and sometimes people increase prices even without a demand. And this is a big risk since Brazil has a complicated inflation risk. Whenever the inflation goes up, we have this kind of uncertainty. But I think that this time things will work well and the inflation will get back to stabilizing. The central bank is pretty much in line with the central bank, and we really believe that Selic and the interest rate does not need to grow too much even with the inflation going up. But all of this will only work well, as I mentioned in the beginning, if the public accounts are well structured. So some alternatives to expand expenses without respecting the limits. Um, so we have this a limit in the Constitution, and so you can increase the expenses, but not too much because we already have a high debt level. So we have to choose what kinds of expenses. If we don't choose what kinds of expenses, and he showed that, but the country works just like our house or a company. If we're spending too much, the first thing we need to do is look inside and say, look, before we start thinking about a new expense, let's review the expenses we currently have. And I think this is what the public expense limit invites us to do. it kind of holds all of the expenses inside a limit, and we have to, for example, choose what are like important social expenses. So the Bolsa Familia is fundamental, but it needs to grow. But it can't grow if it causes more in taxes or more public debt level. So we need to rediscuss this within the public expense limitations. We see currency still dropping. It dropped, it was like 580. Now it's already 520. We think it'll even reach like 490 next year. So there's it's going downwards. The GDP should grow like 3.5, and the interest rate, as we mentioned, will be about 2 and then maybe reach 3 in the second semester. But once again, all of this is anchored in this perspective of sustainability of the public accounts, which is extremely fundamental.
Bom, Caio, e o que a gente tem visto é que há
Well,
várias
Caio, what we've
decisões da
seen,
política que são extremamente importantes para esses cenários. A gente
we
viu
have a lot
você
of decisions
falando
in
de
politics that are
inflação,
extremely
que,
important. So
enfim, vai bater
we
ali
heard you talk about the inflation that'll
número mais,
reach
vai recuar com a
a
retomada da
number, but it should
economia
be
em
recovering
bases,
with
digamos,
the
mais
resuming of the
orgânicas e menos
economy in a more
artificiais.
organic and less artificial
Considerando a
manner
pandemia, a gente
when we
vai
consider
ter,
the
enfim, um
pandemic.
crescimento
And of
também
course,
que
we
pode se
also have
sustentar, que deve se
a growth
sustentar
that could be
fora do
sustained
auxílio
out
emergencial.
of the Corona
E
voucher.
a questão das contas
And of
públicas.
course,
E
we
aí que
have
a
the
gente
public
chama o Richard
accounts
Beck
matter, and
para a
that's when we
conversa,
invite Richard Beck
colocando para
to
ele logo
talk
a
about
pergunta
this and
de $1 milhão, né, Richard?
questioning
A
him
gente não te
about this
chamou aqui para te fazer
$1 million
pergunta
question.
fácil.
We don't want to ask you anything
A gente tem
easy,
uma
Richard.
discussão
So we
intensa no
have an
Congresso sobre as
intense
contas
discussion
públicas
in the
e a
public,
gente tem
in the House of Representatives about public accounts
debate
and
político,
public expenses, and we
essencialmente
have
político, que contamina
an
muito
intense
essa discussão, que
political
é a
debate that's
escolha
really
do
contaminating
próximo
this discussion,
presidente da
which
Câmara
is
dos
the
Deputados e do próximo
choice of the
presidente do
new
Senado Federal.
president of the
Eu
House
queria
of
que você contasse
Representatives
para a
and the
gente quem
Senate.
serão essas
So I would
figuras e
like
como
you
isso
to tell us
interfere na
about
política
who are the
fiscal
main
do governo.
figures that might occupy these positions and how this will interfere in the fiscal policy of the government.
Essa disputa da Câmara e do Senado ganhou
This
ontem
dispute
uma
of
pimenta adicional,
the House of Representatives and the
do
Senate.
Supremo. Acho que no mérito é uma decisão que se sustenta. O contrário seria bastante questionável do ponto de vista jurídico, não é isso que eu estou discutindo aqui. O que precisa analisar nessa
We
história
need to
toda,
analyze
Senado
this,
agora
that
vem
the
também a
Senate,
situação que a gente tinha na Câmara, não é? Com a possibilidade do senador Davi ser reeleito, ele seria reeleito.
with the possibility of President Davi Alcolumbre being re-elected, and now
você já tem hoje
so you already have
pré-candidatos bastante fortes
two
ventilados,
pre-candidates that are very strong. One is Eduardo Braga, that already manifested that if Davi cannot be a candidate, he would be a candidate for PMDB.
Tem o direito de reivindicar, não é regimental, mas é tradicional no Senado. Então, o Eduardo Braga hoje é o nome mais
Eduardo Braga is the most mature name in the political party, MDB political party. And the other name that you have is also Antonio Anastasia, which is already the vice president of the Senate, and he already conducts many sessions, and he's a very well-known name in the financial market. So these are two names that have some form of dialogue with the government, some a little more, a little less, but I think it's important to highlight this. We just had the leak of some sections of the senator about the emergency constitutional amendment, and if they confirm this leakage, we'll consider this as a negative report. And I think this is information that we have to consider, not only from this issue, the dispute in the Senate, but as politics in general, because if you have an ally president in the Senate, and you maybe have a senator in this political party that is maybe considering this report. So I think you need to have some political coordination. And the second is that we should really take advantage of this window of opportunity from March onwards. I think February is a month that's pretty much dead, because you still have a bit of the leftovers of this dispute for the House of Representatives and the Senate. Well, we're going to have Carnival regardless of coronavirus, and then you're going to have to come back with the disputes of the discussions in the House of Representatives and the Senate. And up until
desse relatório da PEC emergencial do senador Vittar,
we have,
claro,
if the government does not have a clear perspective on what they want, we could maybe be surprised with this scary decision, and of course, we could have a bad negative scenario. So is this our scenario? No. Our scenario is that at the Senate, whether it's Anastasia or MDB or a third name, and they're elected not in agreement with the government, but someone that will negotiate with the federal government with an agenda. And I think this is reasonable to consider. In the House of Representatives, we have this dispute with Rodrigo Maia, which is not a candidate for re-election, that's now having to quickly find a solution for his political group, so he has to have a name. And they're kind of, by what we heard from yesterday to today, they've been discussing they're going to set up a block, they're going to choose a candidate. Things are a little locked up, and the negotiations are kind of warming up. But with evidence of Rodrigo Maia not being a candidate, we have some names, such as Aguinaldo Ribeiro, which is the rapporteur, and should maybe discuss. We also have Baleia Rossi, which is in Rodrigo Maia's group. He's also from the MDB. And you also have Marcos Pereira. He's also very well known from the Republicanos political party. And you also have another name of Bezerra Filho, the former Minister of Ministry of Energy, and could be also an important name for this dispute, and some other names that could appear in January if these candidates do not stand this dispute or the machine of killing people that Brasilia becomes during these tense moments. And then maybe Teresa Cristina could be an important name coming with the support of the farmers and the rural political bloc. And of course, you have also maybe the possibility of Minister Carlos Faria, which would maybe need a little more of a construction because he's from PSD and he has to face the same issues with Baleia Rossi, and no one will provide both houses to the same political party. What do these names represent? And of course, Arthur Lira, he has the most consolidated base, and he has government base support, and so of course he could maybe start this, but he could start getting active to help Arthur Lira really have a majority. All of these candidates represent at a greater or a lesser level a discussion with the government, something related to the government agenda. And even with the group of Rodrigo Maia having to make an agreement with the opposition about the central topic, which is the fiscal topic with the reforms, it's a lot more difficult. Of course, they could maybe discuss some smaller micro topics, but I think that the main discussion between them will involve some different positions, and the agenda will be present, but it won't be as extensive as it was in the previous election. And all of this leads to the fact that if the government arrives in March with a organized agenda, and we have to be a lot, maybe have an organized agenda, and saying, look, this is my reform, I need to vote on this, this is important for the government, which is an example of what Kai was talking about, like related to sanitation. So if the government works on this, we have a window for the second quarter to approve in the House of Representatives. We have that constitutional amendment from Pedro Paulo, which is very efficient. We have the possibility of proposing some kind of a budget for 2022 in a different kind of configuration and setting, maybe with a limit that's a little more reinforced. That I think is what's most important. And then, of course, these initiatives, well, the government needs to be really clear in regards to the response for this proposal that was leaked about this proposal related to the fiscal matters, because if the government has some questionable perspectives or
como você
thought
teve nesse que a
processes,
gente vive hoje, e aí o Congresso não sabe o que votar,
then
na falta do que votar, fica com a agenda
the
picada,
House of
não vota
Representatives won't
reforma,
know what
e você
to
vai para um
vote on.
cenário um pouco mais
And then, of
complicado,
course,
porque
you'll
o
have
segundo
more of a
semestre já está
complicated
bem mais
scenario
perto da
with
eleição,
the
dia
second
22,
semester being a
e
lot
aí
closer
o
to the
apetite de
election,
risco,
and then
para
the
usar um
risk
vocabulário do
appetite,
mercado, da
use a bit of
política,
the
ele diminui muito,
market
né, em
vocabulary
Brasília.
will
As pessoas votam menos
shift a lot,
coisas
so people
impopulares em quem está mais
vote
perto da eleição.
less things
Isso
that
é
are
uma
less
regra, uma
popular
tradição.
close to the election. So this is a
Acho que não
rule,
vai ser diferente
political
desse
rule.
ano.
And I think that
Então,
this year
tem
it's
essa
going to be pretty
janela.
much
Acho
the
que
same
esses
situation. So
candidatos
we
estão
have this
aí
window of
na
opportunities. I
Câmara e
think
no
that these
Senado,
candidates
em
that are
maior ou
in the House
menor
of
grau, mas
Representatives and the
todos
Senate
eles têm disposição de
all
conversar com o governo
have the willingness
para
to
avançar com uma agenda de
establish a
reformas. Eu
dialogue with
só acho que
an
se o
agenda of
governo
reforms.
continuar
But I
não
think that if
tendo
the
uma agenda
government
organizada,
continues to not have an
tanto faz
organized
o presidente,
agenda,
tanto faz o que aconteça no
regardless of the
Congresso,
president, who whatever
a gente
happens
vai
in
ficar
the
sendo surpreendido, como falou, e
parliament,
não
we
vai
could be
ser daqui a
surprised
pouco
by
uma
what
faixa
we
tributária,
hear,
se não tiver
like we did
articulação com o
today,
governo,
if we do not have
nada
this
vai andar, porque o
alignment with the
governo
government,
vai ser,
because of
pode na sala que vai
course
atrapalhar um pouco a
the
agenda.
government
Então, acho que da minha
may get
parte,
in the way of the agenda
inicialmente é
even.
isso, acho que
So I
gostaria
think
de
initially
ouvir
that's
aqui,
it.
mas acho que é necessário
But
dizer,
I
tem
think it's important
uma
to
janela,
say
o
that
governo
yes,
tem
there is
poder de
a
negociar,
window.
tem a
The
base lá,
government
os
has
votos
the
estão ali
power
para
to
ser contados,
negotiate. We have the
precisa alguém
base there,
fazer, né? E
and
esse
someone
alguém
just
é o
needs
executivo.
to do this. And this
Bom, para a
is
gente
the
encerrar aqui,
role of the
então,
executive power. So to
acho que o
finish here,
finalzinho do nosso debate a gente podia
the
falar
end
um
of our
pouco,
debate
Caio.
here, I think we
O
could
Richard
talk
teve a
about
oportunidade
Caio.
de falar desse
Richard had the
suposto relatório da
opportunity of
PEC
talking about this
emergencial, dessas informações que
supposed
estão saindo na
report of
imprensa.
this
Essa questão do teto
emergency
de gastos vai
constitutional
ainda gerar
amendment. So this issue
bastante
with the
turbulência na
limitation on
economia até o
public
final do
expenses is still
ano.
going to generate a lot of turbulence
Como é que você
till the end of the year.
avalia
What do
esse
you
comportamento do
assess
governo
in regards to this
e como a
government
gente deve,
behavior?
acho que como o
And
mercado
how
vai
should the
responder a isso?
market respond to this? Well, as I mentioned, I think the topics of the first semester should be activities and inflation. I think the second semester will have public accounts and the expense limitations. Regardless of changes in the rules, it's going to be very complicated to meet the public expense limitations because there are mandatory obligations like social pension, and they're going to grow with the inflation, and the inflation accelerated a lot in the end of the year. So we have a big challenge up ahead, and then we're also going to be close to the elections. It's always a year where the pressure for expense is also increased. The government's been very clearly positioned, especially with the economic team, that maintenance of the limitation of the public expense limitation is fundamental, so that this scenario of the recovery of growth with low interest, inflation under control, currency a little more valued, really works. So some kind of a failure could be critical. And I think the government's going to be thinking about this, but there's going to be a lot of pressure as well. So if the topic of the first semester is the economic activity and inflation, the topics in the second semester will definitely go back to being sustainability and stability of the public expenses.
Obrigada, Caio.
Thank
Bom, eu
you,
queria mais
Caio.
uma
Well,
vez
I would like
agradecer
to
ao
once again
Richard e ao
thank
Caio,
Richard and
nosso
Caio.
coordenador de
Richard,
análise política,
our political
aqui na
analysis
XP Investimentos, o
coordinator
Caio
at XP Investments, and
economista-chefe.
Caio is the
Esse
chief
bate-papo foi super
economist, and
importante, a
this
gente trouxe
conversation was
aqui,
super
enfim,
important. We also
o Caio resumiu que serão
Caio
os
summarized
assuntos
that we'll have
divididos
some of
ali
the
pela época do ano,
topics
inclusive, da economia e da
per
política. O Richard
different
já nos
period in
deu
the
aí
year,
uma
and
senha de que
Richard
vamos
also
ter
gave us some
MDB brigando
tips
forte pelo
about we're probably
Senado,
going to have
Rodrigo Maia
MDB fighting over the
procurando
Senate,
na Câmara dos
and
Deputados
Rodrigo
fazer o
Maia
seu
really
sucessor,
trying to
e a
have a succession
necessidade de
plan,
maior
and
organização
the
do
need for
governo
greater
na pauta
organization
política
from the
para que
government in the
haja
political
aprovação ambiente para
agenda so that
aprovação
we
de
can have an
reformas
environment for
no
the
próximo
approval
semestre. Mais
of
uma vez, eu
reforms
queria
in the
agradecer
next
os nossos
semester.
dois
So I would like to
experts,
once again thank
especialistas
our
que
two
estiveram com a gente agora nesse
experts
painel
and
e
specialists in
passar
this
a
panel.
palavra
And
para
now I will pass
Clara
on the
e
word
para
to
Raquel.
Clara
Obrigada,
and to
meninas. Boa
Raquel.
noite. Bom evento para todos.
Thank you, and have a great event, everyone.
Muito obrigada, Caio,
Thank you very much.
Richard, Débora. Nesse painel, falamos
Caio, Richard,
sobre
and
juros
Deborah.
baixos,
We
falamos
talked
de
about low
inflação,
interest, we talked
falamos
about the
sobre
inflation, we
possíveis
talked about
cenários de reação do mercado.
possible
Então, a
scenarios
palavra de
in
ordem para você,
the
investidor que
market.
está nos
So I think the
assistindo, é
main
diversificação.
word is
A
to
melhor
see
forma de se preparar para
what's
todos
the
os
best way
cenários
to be
possíveis é
prepared for all of these
diversificando a sua
different scenarios,
carteira.
really
Fazer uma rápida
diversifying your portfolio.
retrospectiva do que
With a quick
vivemos esse ano é uma
retrospective
tarefa
perspective is
desafiadora.
a very
Trazer o
challenging
cenário
task.
macroeconômico
So
na
bringing in the
política Coisa boa, muito bem-vindo. E quem vem agora ao nosso encontro é o CEO do Banco XP, José Berenguer. Boa tarde, quase boa noite, Berenguer.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me
E
to
para
participate
formar
in
esse
this panel.
time de especialistas e
Now I would like to
mediar a conversa em parceria com
have
Berenguer,
this team of
o
specialists
chairman do
mediating
Comitê
this
Global de
this
Alocação do
conversation.
XP, Paulo Leme.
So we'll have
Olá,
Paulo Leme as
Paulo.
well from XP. Hello. Hello, good
E antes de
afternoon.
começar essa conversa incrível, vamos soltar a vinheta?
So before we start, let's watch this vignette.
Okay. The vignette is gone, and now we're ready to start. Would you like to start, Paulo, or shall I start? I'll go first. Before anything else, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Good afternoon to everyone. And the first question for Arminio, in terms of global economy and in relation to Brazil, for different reasons, it could be a very favorable scenario for emerging markets. There's liquidity, assets, possibility of capital flowing to emerging markets, commodities prices, an investor looking for returns. And we may be benefited enough for us to delay the reforms. How do you see the external vision and how it will affect us? I see this as the answer is in your question. The scenario of liquidity there's plenty of liquidity. Prices of our products are doing well. The vaccine is working. What? It helps us. And so we have questions fundamental importance, which are very important, more important than the events from outside. It gives us time, but we're going to be careful. Our problems, our fiscal problems, productivity, and the overall climate, there's a lot of uncertainty. Is much more external than internal than external. There seems to be one more chapter in a long story of Brazil being benefited by moments of capital, abundance of capital, but vulnerable to a reversion, an eventual reverse. We know very well that when the climate outside is good, when the stock markets are doing well, maybe even overheated, we're in the second half of the game. I would say we're in the second half of the second half, the second quarter, the fourth quarter. I heard our colleague speaking earlier, a little bit of diversification, caution is worth looking at, taken into consideration. Thank you, Arminio. Thank you, Paulo. I'm going to take the next question. I wanted to mention one thing. It's very nice to be with both of you. In the 90s, Arminio was our big client for foreign debt, and I was the trader and he was the economist. So almost more than 20 years later, the three of us together is at least fun. Arminio, it's a pleasure to have you with us here today. I want to talk a little bit about the capital markets, which are the fiscal policy is expansionist, money supply is eased. What do you expect from the capital markets? How do you expect it to evolve in the next 12 to 18 months with this abundance of resources that we see? Well, before saying anything else, the pleasure is mine as well. It's reciprocal. I have lots of stories to tell about those days. And one day we'll get together and do a more relaxed meeting and share stories with the partners from XP. It's a shame that in our reality, the capital markets is showing an incredible strength, extraordinary strength. The fundamentals are good due to the construction of decades. In the Banco Central, we worked on this, trying to collaborate to create a revolution that came from the private sector, the sector of corporate governance. This is the G of the SGA, which is currently it's of course it's in style right now, and it's a good trend, SG&A. But the market has been evolving. But during a lot of time, we had a market that was with money supplied basically by the BNDES, very cheap money, way below inflation. Today we have inflation very low. Market interest rates are not different from the BNDES rates, and the market has occupied the space. So this is a very important bit of data. In Brazil, a reduction of the BNDES, which has been very much advantaged during this period, left a big hole for the companies. So that wasn't the case with the money that was burning in people's pockets, burning a hole in people's pockets with money that was stopped. It was working as the capital markets are doing what they had to do for alternatives for investors with interesting assets. There's an element of risk in the financial markets. The Brazilian investors is going through a learning phase. That's the origins of XP. It's always been your point to educate your clients. Okay. Thank you. The first part of what's being done in Brazil is this in the second half of the government. The previous governments, not the game's always lost in the second half. So the companies in the previous panel, Brazil is so concentrated on this, so worried about the political situation in the Congress and the economic agenda. So what do you think can be done in terms of containing fiscal contention, in terms of public, having a recovery of the GDP, the increase in unemployment, and if this is enough for a universal dynamic, diverse from the public debt? I'm very concerned, Paulo, about these factors which you just described. You mentioned this in your first question. Brazil, before this crisis, was healing from the other huge crisis in a very short period of time. In the last 6 years, the income per capita in Brazil fell 2%, fell 10%. It should have grown 2% in that period. Instead, it fell by 2%. So what would Brazil be with an increase 25% bigger, or maybe 20%? A lot less people would be unemployed, for instance. We're living in a very tight moment. The answer of the government's answer to the COVID was very big, but it came with a high cost. So today we have a high debt like US and Japan and France with a lot of debt. And this is a vulnerability. So we have three agendas that we need to face. A long evaluation. We have three major areas which need a lot of attention. One of them is the fiscal area. Brazil has an anchor with the spending limits, but it's a minimal. It's not enough if it isn't reinforced. Why? Because the debt will continue to grow, and probably the limit will not stand it. We'll have to approve some type of reforms. These are being discussed. I think as was mentioned here earlier in the previous panel, and I'm not going to repeat it again. However, I see the Congress acting in a more reactive rather than proactive way. This is not the ideal scenario. It's a scenario moved by fear, by conservatism, by survival mode. So what could happen? Some version of these things, constitutional amendments to reinforce our fiscal side, which could redirect certain expenses to the social side, because the country is very needy. Then afterwards, we have to talk about some other reforms, which will give independence to the central bank, and something that are more difficult. The two big, enormous, complicated reforms are the tax reform. The system, that present tax system is an insanity. It's difficult to understand. It's ICMS and all these other things. It's very difficult to make this reform. It's been under discussion for many years. The other is the reform of the state. We have a big state, a big government, but there's lots of room for improvement. There are certain expenses, such as in health, as you mentioned, which are not big enough. There's space for technology, management. It's all crucial, but there's not enough money there. It's a difficult situation. We're looking at a block in which includes the reforms as well, productivity, the opening of the economy. It's a very large space of small parts of the productive area of the country. This side also needs a lot of attention. And there's also a side, which is the side of inequality, which is matched with politics. It's a very fertile land for populism, for adventures, in many cases, because it has this situation of inequality, which includes not just economic inequality, which needs to be faced. It's a country in which people need to believe that they have a chance. We're talking about the opportunities that we have. We three are liberals. We believe in the equality of opportunity and a social protection network, a social safety net. And the space of opportunity in Brazil is very tied up. So there's a big agenda. I'm not necessarily a person who's negative, although right now I have certain worries, but it's a problem. But I think at the same time, it's an opportunity. Today, I see the political environment that's difficult. There are inconsistencies in the big picture, in the agenda between the leadership in the country, some with a more liberal outlook, others less so. So I'm cautious in relation to that space, in Brazil defending itself when things get tighter. Some reforms happen, but it's a difficult route for us to go down going forward. It's a very difficult route ahead of us. I mean, if you were called for the election of 2022 as a candidate to take over the economy as Minister of the Economy, what are the 3 things that you would try to do in the first 6 months of the government to put the country on track? This period, which would be typically a honeymoon for the new government, would have to be taken advantage of to take care of these major issues. I think it's very important that Brazil maintains itself ready to take advantage of windows of opportunity. Whoever might be the next president, nobody knows who the next president might be. However, in that space, we have to do what was not done during this government. The reform of the state is crucial. The reform of the government structure is absolutely crucial. The tax reform, including income tax, which does not connect with this side of the inequality. These are the principal reforms. The rest is a guerrilla warfare. We have to give a lot of detail, a lot of attention to detail. The infrastructure in Brazil, what am I talking about here? I'm talking about everything. It's from energy, transportation, communication, a world of things which affect our day-to-day life. Sanitation, water, sewage, everything in Brazil is a barrier to growth, which makes it more difficult, which makes life more difficult for the productive life of the country. There's a huge space for investment because the demand exists. There are certain sectors of the economy that we don't invest anymore because I have this capacity, have excess capacity. The structure's there. It's a question of organizing the rules of the game, give legal certainty to investors, and then I think that the capital market has a huge opportunity. However, infrastructure is a barrier to investment, and it should be a locomotive for growth. It's a chemistry, alchemy. Let's transform earth into gold through infrastructure. We have to give attention to that. Think about this major theme, this major question of legal security. It's it's a lot of noise in Brazil, a lot of lack of respect, which things that didn't have to happen, which is another theme which I think we have to talk about. We should be a green paradise here. We fit in our space. Here, you could imagine a quality of life which is a paradise. But we have to make the country work and preserve what we have. Today, the postcard of Brazil's is the Amazon, but it's a bad postcard. Because why? Because we're seen as not taking care of this treasure which we have. We don't have to cut one more tree to produce. Technology today in this sector is incredible. We could feed practically the whole world without cutting down one more tree. Why? But we can go beyond that. Pollution. So Brazil has lots of space to get itself organized. At the moment, unfortunately, we're in bad shape. If we don't face these things, we're not going to make any progress. But it doesn't have to be like this. So it's down that road. These are very important initiatives. This question of the environment, which is very important. We need to work on that better. Let me ask I'll come in with one more question. Talk a little bit about Arminio Você in Gávea. You're in Gávea Investments with the gang there, with your colleagues very happily. How do you see at Gávea the reason of environmental risks and in relation to ESG? It's a very important subject for us. We believe that this is a win-win. We don't believe that to take care of the environment, the E of ESG, in English is the environment, to take care of the social. I've spoken a little bit about that, but I think a reduction of inequality is for growth. If the Congress needs to distribute things, that's wrong. To create opportunities, you have to invest in people. It's totally compatible. We have a country with less discrimination, People are going to be more productive, more happier. You're going to incorporate my people into the market, into the labor market. The E, S, and the G, which is governance, which are the things. There's been some big mistakes. The biggest case was Petrobras, but we're passing through a revolution. It's not just starting today. I think it's sensational. In fact, in the public sector, for us in Gavia, it's very important. These are basic conditions in our search for good investments. We look at that, which is necessary. It's not enough for us to invest, and this has been coming in our case. It's over there, almost at the goal, and Brazil needs to kick that ball into the net. Thank you, Arminio. Let's look at the crystal ball of inflation, interest rates, and growth. How do you see 2021? Agro has all of the positive parameters outside, external parameters. Maybe we've been too optimistic in relation to these products, but I believe that in the CDI will have an effect as a healing factor for productivity, for the labor market. This peak of growth will be difficult in the whole world, but even in Brazil, where so many things need to be done, especially in the fiscal area. How do you see this return to growth for people that are concerned with inflation? I'm not worried about inflation. We have inflation of 4%. I think at the moment, interest rates are connected to external factors, and they will remain negative for now. To rehabilitate the capital accounts, on one side, obviously, there was a huge increase in private savings in Brazil. On the other hand, there's a lot of capital in the portfolio side. And I want to see the half of the investments coming from a foreign investment aimed at what you've been discussing in the environmental question. And Brazil can do things in relation to the environmental area and be more green friendly and take away one of the obstacles which keeps foreign investment outside of Brazil. How do you think that interest rates can be fit into that whole scenario? So there's a lot of parts to that equation. From the external side, to begin quickly, I see, as you do, I expected more. Brazil has always been strategically a destination for investments, for a natural destination for investments. So we can take a few mistakes. On the external side, which is what's happening in Latin America, there's a lot of liquidity, but Latin America is now not on the map. Venezuela is bankrupt. Argentina is bankrupt again. Chile, which was the apple of the eye of the region, is having problems and suffering. And Mexico, with NAFTA and everything else, didn't grow. Latin America, as a destination, a strategic destination, is not in the picture anymore. The current account, with this double recession that we had, should have reacted much more. A signal that our economy doesn't have much elasticity in this area. And a third point, which worries me a great deal, which is the exit of personnel, of people. Excuse me, but my Paulos left to study and came back recently. He came back now. I left. I spent 2 or 3 years of my life outside and came back. But this exit of talent, of human capital, is also quite worrisome. And the rest is fine. We have low interest rates, high dollar. This is good. Lots of unused capacity, lots of unemployment. So it should be a space for a cyclical recovery, a good cyclical recovery, but it's locked up by these uncertainties. Brazil is still a country with lots of uncertainties. So we're looking for growth. I'm concerned with inflation. not a short term, but when I see our economy having difficulties, it's difficult to say how far it will go. Unfortunately, around Latin America, we have a lot of experience with inflation, with high inflation and low growth. So we have to get away from that trap. I say that you're doing a good job. It's very difficult to be in their place. This week there's a coupon meeting, an interest rate meeting at the Banco Central, the central bank. The tendency of the rates, the orientation of interest rates, in a moment of so much uncertainty, the central bank intelligently is running from that. They're doing what's necessary. But I think that above everything else is confidence. We have to generate confidence so that Brazil can enjoy a recovery, a strong cyclical recovery. The epidemic is still with us. The pandemic is still with us. So we need something else. It's the answer in questions of health, with the Amazon, the questions connected with the polarization in the political world. It always creates a lot of noise, and we need to clean that noise. It creates a dissonance between the market, which is dominated by the 2% interest rate, and the economy, which is still quite damaged, and it's still moving slowly. So these are the antagonic forces, the opposing forces that are at play. But that's my opinion, my humble opinion. You mentioned, Arminio, the central bank, and the challenge that the directors have in relation to monetary policy. I would like you to comment a little bit about the role, especially in the recent presidents, in relation to development of new technologies and the rest of the market. This role on the part of the regulator, is that important? Do you see what's happening? Yes, it's very important. I see an important opening. And the Banco Central, I've been through there twice. It's very easy to get there and be afraid because you could have problems. I think they're acting very competently, doing what they can. The financial system is going through a revolution. I think it's a pro-client revolution, but the system is also, at the same time, it's solid. You can't just release the system as is happening and should happen and wake up with a crisis. The banks in Brazil are having to adapt. Not long ago, we had a network of agencies which was essential. And there was an entry barrier for competitors. But Brazil had already been mapped out and occupied. Today, a network of bank agencies is more of a cost than an advantage. So the competitors, such as XP, using technology and a mentality of the 21st century mentality, are generating results that are very, very good, very strong results. I'm very optimistic because I see this happening in a way that brings productivity to the companies and brings good services and lower costs on the side of clients. The intermediaries are not, but the size of the cake is growing. The capital market is growing. The risk factors are part of people's lives. We started the conversation. This is not a game where one team wins and the other loses. My belief that this market will develop, that it will be a learning period. We'll have ups and downs. People will have to be aware of that. But it's a win-win. 2 + 2 is 5. Thank you very much. You spoke about some measures that we could take in the next 2 years. One of them has to do with the foreign policy opening, commercial opening. There's a new government in the U.S. which might be more friendly, even though they have a very different line than our current president, but I think that in relation to multilateralism, diplomacy, relationships, opening negotiations in foreign commerce, I see opportunities, a very interesting opportunity for Brazil in relation to recovering as a reference center in the middle of Latin America. At the same time, resolve these two questions simultaneously, both in the question of opening with commercial agreements with the U.S., taking advantage to have part of the chain of supply for inputs that go into China, and also at the same time negotiate something in relation to the environment. How do you see the diplomatic space for Brazil to be able to do these things in these next 2 years? I see a huge amount of space, both diplomatic and political, because in a certain way, the style of the American government in this last period of the Trump administration gave a certain amount of power to the instincts, the most populist and authoritarian feelings, which for them was good. But in relation to the economy, Brazil's been betting for years on a multilateralism. But there's some enthusiasm in the commerce area, in the area of investments. Yes, it went well and it went okay, but in the area of commerce, no. And there was, due to a series of difficulties which exist, for people that want to do business here in Brazil, as you know well, we're stuck in a sort of a trap. On one side, we have an economy closed with lots of subsidies, lots of advantages, artificial advantages for local producers, but with many problems. Barriers that were very high, complicated labor laws, deficient infrastructure, high cost of capital. There's a space of convergence, a place of convergence which is happening now. It's hard to see, but it's happening. In the past, that we had the labor law reform was a good reform. It was something of de-bureaucratization. I think there's more to do. There's a tax reform on the horizon. It's already more or less drawn up. And the cost of capital is falling. Interest rates have fallen. The tendency is things to grow. It's possible to advance in an agenda which you also believe, the more liberal, have to do unilaterally, gradually, but unilaterally. If we sit here and wait for some huge multilateral movement, we might as well sit down and relax. It's going to be for decades. Something that we didn't want to do. I think it was more or less down that road. But this combined agenda, openings of the economy, giving conditions but industry, and I said it's absurd, the BNDES, this is over. It's true. But the industry pays much more taxes than the service sector. We also have to look at that. There's a good space to work on there. These things are stuck, but they're there. They're moving forward. Take advantage of the movement. When the consumer, I think that consumers in macro terms, it's a moment in which the cost of capital and of importation of goods and machines, it'd be a good moment to do that. I also think so. You use that word healing, scarring. I think that's what's happening. We're forming the scars over these wounds and they're healing. But I like to look at the cup half full rather than the cup half empty, but I think it's possible. This is our bet. Otherwise, without that, we don't go anywhere. It makes us a little afraid. I'm in the hospital with a ventilator and I have a breathing tube. If you take the tube out, I die. But the Brazilian business community, has already made a big advance in that area. Arminio, my last question. What's the part that you most like about our economy, where you would concentrate your bets on the next 12 months? The sector that's victorious. Hello? We hear you. The sector that came back, the most successful is agribusiness. However, I'm in the investment world. I have to look as what's the price? And I think that Brazil is a big enough country to have everything. I'm not today. I think there are some sectors that tend to grow, which are traditional, that we can look at. The health sector. Education will have some space. Infrastructure will be a very good bet, incredible. And I hope that this happens in the right way, which is what? Investments for long-term, secure investments, and with slightly lower returns, but avoiding fluctuations. Talking about agribusiness, which is the star of Brazil, these other three sectors, I think a good place to go fishing. Okay. I want to take it. We have 5 more minutes. I want to take advantage to ask you about the community of central bankers. What's your vision of the end game? How do we get out of this confusion? Right now, people are able to travel and have a solution with the virus next year, and the excesses in the fiscal area, but the distortions caused by negative interest rates and by the operation are the Fed, the Treasury, and the Fed. The New York Fed, we don't know what they're going to do. But in this world where we have a huge amount of savings, which is an incentive for leveraging the corporate, non-financial corporate sector, and distortions in the state, individuals who are the biggest buyers of stock in the U.S. market, and forces the investors to make a very high level of leverage and of liquidity. It's not a good thing, because we look at the portfolios. I was 60-40 fixed income and variable income. Today I'm forced to be all equities, to be 100% variable income. How do you see the end of this, the evolution of this scenario in the long term? I see worldwide, in the monetary and fiscal world, a dangerous world. It's nice when things are moving along. Yesterday, we had a meeting of the group of 30, of which I'm part. What is the paradigm today? In the monetary area, with the changes in the Fed, you have a direction of expansionist VS. I'm going to tolerate a little bit. I'm going to allow a little bit of inflation. Okay, fine. And in the fiscal area as well, people are saying interest rates are down. It's going to be down forever, so you can carry more debt because the cost of debt is very low. And now there's an expansionist direction, which from the risk management sector, this system is a factory for a bubble and a very fragile expansion. This is my concern, my worry. I think that in this game, we're also born at halfway through the second half of the game. There needs to be a real economy to validate what's happening out there. So I think it's a model in which the focus of public policy and of people is somewhat damaged, because with the with monetary and fiscal policy will resolve all problems, but it won't resolve problems. It won't resolve the problem of education, of the environment, of the pandemics, of climate change, of productivity, of very complicated issues, the arrival of Asia into the world, religion, terrorism. So we're being a little bit under an anesthetic by a system which could be when I talk about my colleagues outside of Brazil, I know these guys pretty well, and they say, why don't you leave Brazil? Could be Brazil, after this moratorium, many of these things don't work. They last for a while. So go ahead while the party is going on and go dancing to the music. But sooner or later, there'll be it'll be because of an exaggerated use of steroids and cortisone for the patient. You take monetary cortisone, fiscal cortisone, and it's a legacy. I think that sometimes it's worth it leaving some excess returns on the table and look at more conservative instruments, inflation protection, and as we know, market timing can still work. Thank you very much. It's been a super pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Congratulations for everything that you're doing. Caio, back to you. Thank you. This was a very nice panel. We had important reflections about what to expect in Brazil, not just for 21, but even going forward. Important reflections about what to expect from Brazil going down the road in the future, and what should be done, in the opinion of several different specialists, to really regain a sustained and sustainable recovery, because this question of sustainability is very important for the agenda that was raised, very essential for productivity and for investments, and a Brazil that after the pandemic, which will in fact recover its investments and become the golden eggs from the chicken. In this agenda, which talked about infrastructure, commercial opening, much beyond the monetary policy, interest rates, fiscal policy, as we discussed here. So going beyond that, beyond the importance of all of this agenda of productivity, I have the pleasure to call here our next panel. You gonna go? Our next about the tax reform.
I have the pleasure to invite the special advisor of the Ministry of Economy, Vanessa Cannabis.
Vanessa, go ahead.
Yes, good evening, Raquel. I'm here. Thank you for your virtual presence as well. Oh, besides Vanessa, we also have the presence of the economist and director of the Center for Fiscal Citizenship, and one of the main brains behind one of the fiscal reforms being discussed in the House of Representatives, which is
Boa noite, Raquel. Boa noite a todos.
Bernard
Estou aqui também.
Good evening, Raquel. Good evening, everyone. All right, great. And to support us during this conversation, I would like to once again invite our chief economist, Caio. Welcome back. Thank you, Raquel. And besides Bernard and Vanessa, we also have our foreign secretary of the Internal Revenue Service, Receita Federal, George Hashid. It's a pleasure to see you around here as well. Thank you. Good evening. We have such an important panel with so many important stars, and that's why I even forgot some important names, but I will let you discuss this important topic, which is the fiscal reform, and also be participating and taking notes of each of these important points. Okay, thank you, Raquel. Thank you for the intro. Now let's quickly go over our vignette. Very well. We're back now, and once again, continuing our event with some different debates in Brazil for next year. And we can't talk about fiscal risks and growth risks, as well as challenges and difficulties, without covering the tax issue and the fiscal matters. So if we have surveys with consumers, company owners, and we ask them what's their main challenge for business in Brazil, I think we'll have a lot of topics with bureaucracy, infrastructure, but the fiscal matters will definitely be highlighted as one of the most important. So the multinational company says they need to hire a certain amount of people for their accounting areas and for fiscal law aspects, but also other people in all of the other departments. So the amount of people spent is very significant. And even the main international rankings demonstrate this. So that ranking doing business shows that Brazil does not have such a good position, but especially in this with the challenge of paying taxes because the tax load is very heavy, but this brings in this crucial challenge. And so I have the pleasure to invite maybe three of the most important specialists in this topic. We have Vanessa. She has academic experience and she's now contributing a lot with these different debates. We have Bernard Api. He's also been going through this for quite a while. And Hashiji as well, with quite a bit of experience in Brazilian fiscal management. And so let me start talking about over here. And we'll start off with Vanessa. So what is the ideal reform? Where should we start to reform the Brazilian tax system? Vanessa, you can start, and then we'll have Api and Vanessa finally. Thank you, Caio. It's great to see you again, even if just virtually. So not only due to your exit, but also because of the pandemic. Well, I think that the tax reform and the payroll tax reductions are two main points for the next month because the reduction in the tax load on payrolls due to the incentives for formal jobs and also all of the other collateral effects of the pandemic and the COVID Corona voucher. But however, the exoneration of payroll, tax exonerations, and the issues with the tax reform, they do happen at the same level or standards when we talk about this exoneration from payroll taxes. Of course, we have some issues, but no doubt the main challenge of payroll tax exoneration and tax exemptions, which Minister Paulo Guedes has tried to face ever since he joined the government, is how to avoid such a big payroll load that has grown so significantly throughout the years. So as we leave this challenge aside a bit, and maybe it's a little beyond what we could be working on currently, because since there is this matter and maybe So no doubt consumption it would be the main some things that we're advancing in with this discussion. So I think that this period where we're still in the pandemic, we're not in the post-pandemic yet, differently than what people may believe in, is maybe the best moment for us to discuss the tax reform. I watched a bit of the previous panel with Arminio and Paulo Leme, and I think that the discussion about the debt level in Brazil and the concern with the collateral effects of this are completely connected to the tax reform issue. The tax reform issue is a major ingredient that motivates economic growth, not only due to the increases and gains in productivity, due to the level of distortion caused by our system, especially with taxing for consumption, but also because the reform of a consumption taxation process that considers a simplicity standard and that maintains some strong tax collection levels really favors an important business environment and thus new investments and new competitive advantages. I also heard Arminio talk about the agro sector, which is a sector that in the past years that I've been monitoring macroeconomics is certainly a sector that's very promising and successful. But I think it could be even more successful. The competitive advantages in our agribusiness sector could be even greater if we had a tax system that had complete exoneration of exports and that could favor some industrialization and would really avoid disturbances in the taxation system. So if we consider that the exit from the pandemic or this major debt level that we had to undergo during this period goes through this economic growth, since I don't consider that we'll have economic growth if we do not improve our productivity, if we do not have economic openings, that certainly some of the international industries will go through. And of course, the improvement of our competitive advantages of our companies. And of course, this also depends on the taxation reform and in regards to priorities to improve the business environment in Brazil. And certainly the complexity of the indirect taxation system is probably more relevant. So I think that everything we're discussing here is not related to the tax load, about increasing or reducing tax loads. I think this is just redesigning the system that can favor the business environment and the investments and the competitive approaches in our industries and the improvement of the resource allocation to improve our stagnated demand. So I think these are important points for the beginning of our discussion. And it's a pleasure to be here with Bernard and Rashid as well. I hadn't spoken to them for quite a while. And Rashid, actually, I've never met, but it's a pleasure to meet him for the first time. Thank you, Vanessa. Excellent. That was great to hear and listen to you once again. And I think also it would be very important to bring in the government's perspective into this debate. So Bernard, what's your vision and what are the next steps that we should be advancing in? The 45 constitutional amendment, PEC
Bom, antes de mais nada,
45.
queria agradecer o convite de participar do debate, cumprimentar a Vanessa, cumprimentar o Rashid. Os dois são meus ex-colegas de trabalho, o Rashid, na época que eu estive no governo, a Vanessa, quando ela estava no CICIF, cumprimentar o Caio. Então, na verdade, quando a gente vai discutir o que é um bom sistema tributário, o que é um bom sistema tributário? Está até na literatura. Obviamente, a função do princípio do sistema tributário é arrecadar para poder financiar políticas públicas. Mas, ao fazer isso, ele tem duas características desejáveis. Uma ele tem que ser o mais progressivo possível, e aqui a gente não tem que olhar só para a tributação, tem que olhar para a tributação e o gasto junto, mas sim, se você puder ter a tributação progressiva, isso é bom, e ele tem que ser o mais eficiente possível. Na verdade, ele tem que atrapalhar o mínimo possível o funcionamento da economia. E é isso, um sistema tributário eficiente e progressivo é o ideal de qualquer país que arrecade para financiar políticas públicas. A gente no Brasil tem problema em todas as categorias de tributos. Então, você vai perguntar qual é a agenda de reforma do sistema tributário brasileiro, ela envolve a reforma dos tributos gerais sobre bens e serviços, que são, quando bem desenhados, tributos sobre o consumo. Ela envolve a reforma da tributação da renda. Nós temos distorções absolutamente injustificáveis no Brasil. Depois, no debate, eu posso dar alguns exemplos, mas injustificáveis. Pessoas de altíssima renda que pagam pouquíssimo imposto no nosso país, e isso, inclusive, traz junto distorções alocativas. Temos a reforma da tributação da folha, como disse a Vanessa, que conceitualmente deve ser vista junto com a reforma da tributação da renda do trabalho, porque elas são absolutamente imbricadas. A tributação da folha é uma forma de tributação da renda do trabalho e, ao mesmo tempo, uma forma de financiamento dos benefícios da Seguridade Social. E é importante entender isso na hora que se for discutir a reforma da tributação da folha. Tem melhorias a serem feitas nos tributos patrimoniais brasileiros, e tem uma agenda, uma área que a gente conversa um pouco menos, que são os tributos regulatórios. Entre esses, eu acho que, sobretudo, os tributos ambientais, que vêm ganhando destaque no debate mundial sobre o bom desenho de um bom sistema tributário. Um bom sistema tributário contempla, sim, tributos que corrigem externalidades negativas, especialmente na área ambiental. Bom, dentro dessa agenda, o que está mais maduro é a reforma da tributação do consumo. Por quê? Porque é um tema que o Brasil já vem discutindo há muitos anos, a gente já tem muita experiência. Eu, pessoalmente, participei de duas tentativas frustradas de reforma tributária quando eu estive no governo, tá certo? E elas já vinham herdando de governos anteriores. E segundo, porque do ponto de vista de impacto sobre o crescimento é sem dúvida nenhuma mais importante. Do ponto de vista de eficiência econômica é mais importante. A Vanessa colocou isso aqui de forma clara. Eu sou economista, mas quem fala de economia aqui é a Vanessa. Ela entende hoje mais do que eu. Sim, ela gera problemas seríssimos de produtividade, gera problemas seríssimos de competitividade por N motivos, por causa da complexidade, que faz com que o custo burocrático de pagar imposto no Brasil seja monumental, por causa do litígio tributário que vem por conta da complexidade, por causa do fato de que, por falhas no desenho da tributação de bens e serviços, nós temos uma grande cumulatividade que onera exportações e investimentos e reduz o potencial de crescimento, e porque o sistema tributário faz com que a economia brasileira se organize de forma totalmente ineficiente. Então, sim, eu acho que é a que está mais madura e, sem dúvida nenhuma, mais importante para o crescimento do país. O que nós temos hoje que traz mais otimismo com relação ao avanço dessa agenda de reforma da tributação de bens e serviços? Eu acho que é uma condição política extremamente favorável, muito mais favorável do que em todos os momentos, pelo menos desde a Constituinte, quando eu comecei a acompanhar esse tema. E é favorável por quê? Por um lado, por conta que nós temos um Congresso reformista e um grupo dentro do Congresso claramente envolvido com a agenda da reforma tributária, e isso acho que é muito importante, quer dizer, tem os patrocinadores com condições políticas de patrocinar a boa reforma tributária. Segundo ponto, nós estamos hoje com os 27 estados apoiando a reforma tributária, coisa que era impensável alguns anos atrás. Jamais se conseguiu o apoio de todos os estados com a reforma tributária, da forma, no modelo da PEC 45, que substitui 5 tributos, PIS, COFINS e IPI, que são federais, ICMS estadual e o ISS municipal, por um único imposto sobre bens e serviços. Hoje, os 27 estados estão apoiando uma reforma que acaba com o ICMS, acaba com a guerra fiscal e propõe a substituição por um imposto sobre bens e serviços com regras uniformes, sem nenhum benefício fiscal. Isso é uma novidade monumental em termos do ambiente
monumental
político para a
news
reforma
when we think about
tributária
the environment, the
no
political
Brasil.
environment for
Não quer
tax
dizer que não
reforms
tenha
in Brazil.
problemas, tem
That
algumas
does not
questões
mean that
sim, que ainda
there
precisam
are
ser
that
resolvidas.
there aren't problems. There are matters that
Temos
must be
ainda
solved.
algumas resistências
Of course, we
setoriais,
have some sector
embora tenha
resistance,
estudos que mostrem que
although
quando
there are
considerado o impacto
studies that
sobre a
demonstrate that
produtividade,
when
mesmo de
consider
forma
the impact on
conservadora,
productivity,
todos os
especially
setores
in
da
a
economia
conservative
são
approach, all of the
beneficiados,
sectors
uns
in the
mais,
economy are
outros menos,
benefited, some
mas
more
todos
than
são
others,
beneficiados
but
pela
all
reforma
are
tributária.
benefited by the
Tem
tax
alguma
reform.
resistência ainda dos
And
grandes
of course,
municípios,
there
mas
are
acho que é
some
possível
resistance from big
resolvê-la.
municipalities, but I
E
think this is
temos, com
possible
relação a
to
essa reforma da
modify
tributação de
and
bens e
solve.
serviços, uma
And
posição
also in
ambígua do
regards to
governo
the
federal, às vezes
taxation of
apoiando,
the
às
goods
vezes
and
não,
services, there's
tendo uma
an
posição
ambiguous
que
perspective from
oscila
the government,
entre
sometimes
uma
supporting
posição
this,
favorável
sometimes
e uma
not
posição
supporting
que
it. So it
não é tão
varies with like a
favorável.
favorable and not so
Nesse
favorable
ambiente,
perspective.
a
But in
reforma
this
vinha
environment,
caminhando muito bem no
the
começo
reform
do
was
ano.
moving ahead
Tinha
very
formado uma
positively.
comissão mista de
We
deputados e
had a
senadores para
mixed
tentar convergir a
commission
proposta da
with
Câmara, que é a PEC
senators and
45, com a
representatives
proposta do Senado, que é a
with
PEC 110,
Constitutional
vinha
Amendment
bastante bem,
45 and
mas aí veio a
proposal from the
pandemia, que
Senate,
atrasou,
which was the
parou
Constitutional
durante
Amendment
vários meses o
110,
debate.
and then we had the
Depois da
pandemic that really
pandemia,
interrupted all these
veio as
months of
eleições
debates, and then
municipais,
we
que
had the
atrasaram mais
municipal
ainda, e
elections that also
agora
delayed this even more.
o
And
clima
now,
político
of
está todo
course, we
contaminado
have a political
pela
climate that's
sucessão na
completely
Câmara e no Senado,
contaminated by the
mas eu
succession
acho
in
que o
the
tema
House
está
of
maduro. Na
Representatives
hora
and
que
in the Senate.
tiver, que
But I
der uma
believe that the topic
acalmada
is very mature.
no Congresso
As soon
Nacional,
as
acho que
things are
tem
a little more
condições de
calm in
avançar.
Parliament,
E é
we can
importante, e é uma
advance.
agenda muito
And I
importante
think this
nesse
is a
momento. É
very
importante
important
por dois
agenda at this
motivos.
moment. It's important
Por
for two reasons.
motivo,
One,
porque, como a Vanessa
because
disse, tem um
as
impacto
Vanessa
muito
mentioned,
forte
there's
sobre o
a very
crescimento de longo
strong
prazo.
impact on long-term
E
growth.
esse impacto sobre o
And
crescimento de
this
longo prazo tem um
impact on
impacto muito
long-term
relevante
growth
sobre a
is very
solvência do
relevant
país.
on solvency.
Quando você cresce mais, se você
When you
controlar a
grow
expansão
more,
das
if you can
despesas,
control
você
the
tem um resultado
expansion
primário
of
maior
expenses,
e
you
um
have a
maior
greater
denominador da
primary
relação
result and a
dívida-PIB, que é um
greater
PIB maior,
denominator
e
of the
o
ratio
impacto
between
de
the
uma boa
GDP
reforma
and debt level,
tributária sobre a
and the
trajetória
impact of a
dívida-PIB no
very
longo prazo
good
é muito relevante, é muito forte,
reform is
e
very
isto se
relevant,
reflete no
and
curto
this is
prazo
reflected in the short
em
term
melhoria de
and
expectativas,
also
redução
an
de juros de longo
improvement of
prazo, e pode ser
expectations and
muito útil
long-term
para sair
interest
da
reduction,
pandemia.
which
Ainda que os
can be
efeitos
very
sejam de longo
useful to
prazo, se a gente
alleviate a
aprovasse a
pandemic.
PEC 45
Even if we
hoje,
think about effects
a
in
gente
the
ia ter
long run, if
3
we had
anos e meio,
approved
4 anos
the
antes de começar a
Constitutional
ter
Amendment
efeitos
45, we'd
relevantes
have
sobre a
3 or
economia.
4 years
1 ano e
until we can
meio,
actually
2
see
para
relevant effects on the economy. At least
estruturar,
one
para a
and
gente
a
começar a
half
cobrar,
or 2
depois
years
mais
to
2 anos num
structure this,
período de teste,
and then
e a
another 2
partir daí
years
começa
for
a
test
transição
periods,
para
and that's
valer,
when you actually
mas
have
ainda
the
assim os
real
efeitos de
effect
curto prazo podem
noticed.
ser muito
But even so, the
relevantes.
short-term
Eu acho que é
effects
isso,
can
para
also be
começar a
very
conversa,
relevant.
acho que
So
esse
to
é
start
o
off the debate, I believe that
quadro que eu
this
estou
is
vendo hoje na
the
discussão da
current
reforma
scenario
tributária.
in the discussion of the tax reform. Excellent, Api. Thank you very much. You gave us a very optimistic, actually, perspective in regards to the approval and evolution of the tax reform. Maybe a hypothesis which is maybe a little heroic in a calmer situation in Parliament, which maybe in the short term is very difficult to imagine could be possible. But certainly throughout the long run and next year, we can have we've talked about this in our first panel, especially in the first semester of next year. We should have a window of opportunities for markets and also in the legislative sector to be able to advance with these important topics. So thank you very much. Now I would like to pass it on to Hashiji. The Jorge Hashiji is our secretary. And when I was in the government here at the municipal government in São Paulo as the Secretary of Finance, I also had the pleasure of interacting with Mr. Jorge Hashid. So I would like to hear your initial vision and perspective on the tax reform perspectives and what's the best pathway to follow up ahead. Well, good evening, everyone, and good evening, Caio. Thank you so much for this invitation to participate in this event. It's a pleasure to be with you. Vanessa, it's a pleasure to be with you as well. And once again, the Benapi, we had many meetings together, and Caio as well. Due to some major challenges during his tax administration in the municipal government in São Paulo, and also at the Internal Revenue Service, the Receita Federal. And I'm going to highlight my perspective, my opinion, that certainly the need to promote structural changes in Brazil exists. And this guarantees greater stability in public accounts and in a more favorable business environment, no doubt. However, in my perspective, there is a need to put into practice urgently some different actions geared towards the resuming normal economic activity. So I think this is the fundamental agenda at the moment. The challenge is to stabilize public accounts and reduce the increase of unemployment levels caused by the pandemic are huge. And in my perspective, the tax system has a lot to contribute towards overcoming this agenda, not only to allow for the needed funding of the state, but also to not cause new disruptions or harm taxpayers more and more. So I do not intend to affirm that the tax system in Brazil is one of the best, no doubt. There is need to improve it, and this improvement is constant. I don't defend great, huge events like, oh, let's have huge events to be able to have an effect in 10 or 15 years. No, we need to have a permanent structure. We must have a permanent updating process of the tax system. Nowadays, we see Europe, for example, even in the UN committee, we have been working on this with the taxation of the digitalization of the economy. And all of the efforts are focused on taxation that are based on sales and not on added value. So the process is dynamic and the tax system changes with the economic reality. And this is a cycle that will continue. The next point is the diagnosis, in my perspective, is very well known. So I would place myself, Caio, Vanessa, and Bernard. Why not start off with the necessary changes, correcting through some regulations and for institutional regulations and other devices and procedures that could promote that generate judicial and administrative disputes that actually scare away some investors due to the lack of legal security. So here I want to highlight a point that's important to register, that some of the main disputes that we have in the contentious environment and some of the greatest lacks of precision and compliance costs are not related to the tax models that are being criticized at the moment in Brazil or that are adopted in Brazil. So I do not want to debate whether or not the value is good, the limits are good, yes or no. I think everyone knows about my opinion, but I'd say that the models practiced here in Brazil, at least over 96% of the companies, and then I will start providing some more precision. The companies that choose the lucro presumido accounting model add up to 96% of the companies, the assumed profit accounting model. And for example, Vanessa might have numbers that are a little more updated, but I remember that the universe of transactional volumes for the non-accumulative taxes like PIS/COFINS are about 80%. So it's like a 20-80 ratio. So in my perspective, I believe that we must search immediately for short-term effects, short and mid-term. We should search for the improvement of the legislation imposed. So back then we had already discussed, of course, that evidently in a country with a single tax, this would be excellent, but just unifying it now with 5 taxes and creating a 6 to be able to converge throughout a decade, why not unify this and solve problems so that we can provide immediate responses to these taxpayers? And I consider that these are measures and it is possible, no doubt. I will give you a very clear example. Simples Nacional has 8 taxes. So if you do not have an electronic system, you won't be able to fulfill it. It's extremely complex. But we did provide a electronic system where the taxpayer can provide half a dozen information, and you have a single obligation. And the taxpayer, this is the vision. The investors want to think about what they're going to be paying here in Brazil. So now I have a challenge to, like Vanessa mentioned, the payroll issue. So like, oh, I want to invest in Brazil. How much will this cost with payroll? I would have to ask you, well, what are the sectors? What's the product you produce? And we reached the point of having some tax quotas. So some situations like this can't prosper, and these are changes that can be made in regard to the ICMS and ISS. These are complementary laws. And so will we solve all of the problems? No, certainly not. But I'd say that at least 80% would be solved. And if we can converge and improve this in the legislation with immediate responses in the short and midterm, I believe we have this challenge to be able to get back to normality and our economic activities. And then, of course, new challenges, new agendas will come up ahead. So I think these are my first initial comments to be able to begin this debate. Thank you, Hashiji. This is excellent. I think that your initial comments and final comments and the points that Bernard talked about in the beginning about the strategy for the approval of the reform, I would like to go back to Vanessa also with some of the peak comments about these 2 points. So what's the best strategy? If the best strategy would be to start off as the constitutional amendment proposes with a big bang, or maybe the best strategy would be to have like phases with federal taxes. And finally, what you think about this criticism that appears in regards to this transition phase, and how up ahead we will have a system that's more simplified, but in the middle of the way we will have maybe even more complexity, and maybe you have the old and new system kind of moving together. So how do you consider these 2 points that were highlighted? I think the initiative of which is really in line with what Hashiji mentioned in the newspaper recently, which is trying through a law, but maybe not through a constitutional amendment, to improve the business environment, some more immediate measures. But on the other hand, really in line with what was already being presented. So the CBS is very, although there is a taxation on revenue and sales, but of course you have the non-cumulative aspect that's essential for the simplicity, for the issue of the growth, economic growth. So I think the first step that the federal government took, really taking advantage of the work that was being done with unifying the PIS/COFINS taxes and trying to increment this with the experience that I had with CECIF and also the international experience with Secretary Toschi, but also with a trend of convergence in order to not have to converge completely, even because of a hierarchy issue. So it's a constitutional amendment versus a law, but of course converging, especially with the design. So these 2 initiatives are pretty much in line with what Secretary Hashiji mentioned. So I think that the political issues in the pandemic maybe got in the way a bit, but no doubt the discussions on the tax reform are very mature in society to be incorporated. And regardless of this, I do believe that both things can occur together, and something that can be done immediately and must be done immediately. We cannot wait, especially from a federal level, to eliminate these PIS/COFINS discussions and only talk about them in 10 years. So we have an editorial from the Folha de São Paulo talking about the growth of the tax liability in the federal government, and also the contentious levels, which are stratospheric compared to other countries. And I think that the structural reform is unavoidable, and I think the economic growth will only have results if we really focus on the root of the problem. But I must agree as well that there are immediate measures that must be implemented, and things are not excluding. There's a single balance when we think about Bernard and Rashid that we must find in public policy and tax. In the tax sphere is really a balance between three main vectors. So you must have a simple regime, and I think that taxation on revenue really meets this principle, but you must also really focus on other issues with maybe the creation of the Simples Nacional and PIS/COFINS. Another point that we cannot forget is the economic impact aspect of the cumulative approach and the segregation between services and products and goods for the evolution of our industry and commerce, which is very relevant. So I think we've advanced a lot in Brazil when it comes to the simplicity. Of course, we wanted to simplify a system that was very complex, but now we have a very complex system, and maybe for some of the people a simple system, but that in some way gets in the way of the economic impacts. And the third point, which is the distributive impact. So I think the most difficult, according to my experience, that comes from the CECIF and now with the government as well, which is balancing out these three variables. You cannot build a tax system that is difficult to inspect and fulfill. And we have some distribution aspects that are important that must be corrected in income tax and also even on taxes on consumption. But we cannot leave aside the potential, the harmful potential that the tax system has upon on our productivity. So our national industry, and so this we have not been able to have more competitive approach and modernization through this model. But of course, when there's major limitations on the cumulative approach and the integration of services as well as the simplicity, or maybe not so much complexity. So I think we must have this balance. Now, to be able to change things, although once again, well, I want to highlight that the government's initiative really meets what Secretary Hashiji has discussed and also is in line with the structural reform that the House of Representatives has been leading. Each strategy will have pros and cons. There's not something that's better or worse. So if we only approve the CBS now, people will probably understand how good it is to have an EVA in Brazil. According to these structures, they'll be able to understand what the potential of the legal security simplification is and the business is for the business environment. But on the other hand, we cannot wait or expect a major impact from economic impact and growth of productivity, because the main cumulative aspects and complexity aspects are present in the municipal and state taxes. So we'll win on one side and lose on the other. But of course, a greater reform such as the IBS, including income taxes and payroll taxes, is great because it'll affect all of the problems in the tax system. So the impact is a lot greater. But on the other hand, this bigger impact also causes more challenges because you're going to be messing with a lot more players and stakeholders. So I think that now we maybe need to set up a more political scenario to understand within these pros and cons where we can combine a greater amount of positive points. the greatest transition cases are better for people that have long-term investments because they ensure returns on investments within the term that was initially idealized. But it's worse because it postpones the complexity of the system for a longer period. A shorter period maybe harms the return on some investments, which is not good from the business environment perspective, but it brings in more simplicity. So maybe we're lacking a bit of clarity about the different pros and cons. And what are the values that are most important to the House of Representatives that will maybe say, okay, this is gonna be important and this won't, and how government can continue to collaborate in this process. Thank you very much, Vanessa. Bernard? Well, I believe that first of all, if it's better to have like a big bang or a phased process, I think that Vanessa highlighted an important and fundamental point, which is from the perspective of the impact on productivity and growth, the greater reform will have a major impact, a lot greater. And this will, of course, affect all of the trends and pathway for the country. So my assessment is if there's a political condition to have a broader reform, of course we should. It's a lot better to do so. And the political resistance to a reform of fiscal fees only is maybe not that much smaller. Of course, it removes some federative aspects, but from the sector perspective, it's not that much smaller. The service sector has some resistance to CBS and also to the IPS. So now one thing that can be discussed is a reform that can be made partially. It's like a broad reform, and then it can start at federal level and then extend to the state and municipal level. So I believe that this could be a bit problematic, but eventually it could be a quicker transition that I don't think will lead to any reason as to why not do this. But why would you have something more restricted if you have the opportunity to have something broader? So from the perspective of growth, it's the main agenda that Brazil needs to consider when we think about the impact on growth in the 10 or 20-year horizon. So, of course, you have the reform of the taxation on consumption, and this is very important. And Vanessa mentioned another thing about the time frame. Well, because the long term, it provides a greater legal security, but it's completely distorted, and people that invest in the wrong places, in the wrong sectors, in the wrong ways, due to our tax system. Now, if you quickly change this, the company and investment that you set up will have to sell with a very low margin, or maybe you won't even be able to sell due to the investments you were having. So you have to give some companies some security. And that's really accommodate some changes in relative prices, and this could have some negative effect if it's done too quickly. And if it's in the long run, it could have a bigger and long-term impact that's better absorbed by the economy. But the Constitutional Amendment 45, we have a group actually that's discussing this, and we noticed that from the complementary obligation perspective, you'd be able to register purchases done with an electronic invoice. And certainly the increase of its complexity is basically null in the structure that's being set up in the IBS with a homogeneous tax that's a lot simpler for all sectors. So we need to understand this. The elite increasing complexity does not exist. And I really believe that it would be a mistake to... Well, I wanted to quickly talk about what Hashiji mentioned, and I disagree with you, Hashiji. I think we can have this kind of disagreement in this debate, but I think our simplified regime system is probably one of the biggest disasters, one of the biggest disasters. I was not clear, this was not clear to me when I was in the government, but this model where you have a taxation on revenue, and let's talk about
valor adicionado, tributo
the
sobre a
simples
renda
or
e
the
tributo sobre a
simple
folha. A soma da renda, do
taxation
lucro
and
com a
also the
folha é o
assumed
valor
profit
adicionado.
model.
Ou seja, você montou um sistema quando você tributa o
So when
faturamento,
you have
favorece
taxation
muito a
on
empresa que tem
revenue
alta
that
margem.
favors
Muito,
companies
e
that
não
have high
favorece quem tem
margins,
baixa
and it does
margem.
not
Então,
favor
você cria um
companies that
sistema que
have
cria uma
lower
distorção
margins. So you
enorme no
create a
funcionamento
system
da
that creates a
economia e
huge
gera
distortion in
distorções
the functioning
distributivas
of the economy,
injustificáveis. No regime
and
dos
it
Estados
generates
Unidos,
huge distortion.
vamos pegar
So
um
in
profissional
the
liberal
let's
que,
say
sei lá,
a
tem uma renda de R$200 mil
freelance
por
worker that
mês,
has like a
renda pessoal,
200,000
em
real
que as
income per
despesas da
month,
empresa dele são
and the expenses of
20%
his company are
do total da despesa
20%
da empresa, os
of the
tributos
total
sobre a
amount of
renda dele
expenses in the company, and the taxes on his
representam
income represent
13,2% da renda.
13.2% of his income,
Enquanto que
while
empregado formal
a
paga
formal
27,5% de
employee
imposto de
pays
renda e se ele recebe acima do
27.5%
teto,
income tax,
a
and if he
contribuição
receives
sobre folha
above
que
the
incide
limit,
acima do teto, incide acima do teto, é um
he
imposto sobre a renda dele
will
também.
pay
Somando tudo dá
taxes on his
42%.
income as well, almost
Então, eu moro
42%.
num país em que
So I
o
live in a
empregado
country
formal que ganha
where a formal
R$6.100,
employee
a
that
alíquota
makes
marginal dele é 42%,
6,100 reais has
e um profissional liberal do lucro
42% tax
presumido que tem renda
rate
de
paid,
R$200 mil,
and
a alíquota
a
marginal sobre a renda dele é de 13%.
liberal professional
Realmente é
has only
injustificável esse
13%.
modelo,
So it's
injustificável. A gente tem que
unjustifiable.
rever.
We
Não
must
dá para dizer porque é simples. Eu acho que o modelo
clearly
de
discuss
simplificar
this. I think
tributando
the
faturamento
simplification of
para empresas com
taxation
grau
on
de
revenue for
faturamento do
companies
lucro
that have
presumido. E
a
mesmo para as empresas do Simples, a não ser para empresas
presumed
muito
profit
pequenas,
model
é um modelo
is a
completamente errado. A gente tem que rever
completely wrong model in my
esses modelos,
perspective.
Rashid. Não acho que seja uma
I
vantagem do
don't
sistema
think this
brasileiro,
will
não.
be an
Essa é uma das razões
advantage
pelas
of
quais
the
o Brasil
Brazilian
não
system.
cresce.
This is one of the main reasons why Brazil is not growing. Hashid, I want to hear you, not only about this final point that Benar mentioned, but also from the perspective of implementation, the practical implementation, when you think about the long experience you've had at the administration of the federal revenue system. So what are the risks of implementing this reform like this, besides these final topics that were being presented about the simplification that generated a very big debate till today, actually? Of course, Kai, thank you very much. Well, certainly. One point that our tax model needs to be overcome through different change pathways and infraconstitutional measures is the issue with the segregation of taxes, such as ICMS and ISS, which is a fact. But the distributive impact could be made through other pathways. In my perspective, the company owners want to know what their tax costs will be, how much they're actually going to be paying at the end of the day. It doesn't really matter how they're going to pay this, but they want to know how much they pay. And then to answer Bernard's point, of course, we know you even talked about this. The good thing about debates is that you can disagree, right? So it's an important point where you see the discussions that are being highlighted. We've been discussing for the past 2 years issues related to taxes on consumption. And in my perspective, there is a need to unleash these debates due to the measures, the infraconstitutional measures and legal measures, and even the administrative measures. So this point that you mentioned is really a tax income change. And of course, there's a major distortion here when you choose the presumed profit model, especially at a moment where you're having the profit distribution and dividends, payment of dividends in the company. But there's a solution for this, and this can be solved through legal regulations. It is possible to work on this, and also we can improve our relationship with other countries to be able to search for new agreements to avoid this double taxation with the incidence of this taxation. But this this is to be able to call other countries so that they can also reduce their tax values. So, and back then in the government, we also had some challenges to implement some measures. So everyone pretty much embrace this proposal for the constitutional reform. So, in my perspective, the impact that Bernard mentioned that would happen with the invoices, I think that from the moment where you have a new legislation enter, we'll have new debates, including judicial debates. So, Caio, I don't want to remember the name of a tax that finished in 2007, but it was a contribution that was so simple, it was just provisional, and that was affecting and calculated upon a certain transaction that you didn't even have complementary obligations, and this led to disputes and lawsuits due to this contribution of this tax. So imagine if you have a new tax that will reach, maybe we have ICMS at about 7% of the GDP, and ISS is about an additional 1%. So you have like 8% plus about 4.5% that we have on PIS/COFINS. We also have IPI, and this is a major impact. So you're concentrating taxation on a single tax, and this will lead to discussions, no doubt. Even this, until this legislation is stabilized throughout time, we'll have major challenges. One example that Bernard mentioned about credit. I've been monitoring these discussions, Bernard, through the press, and I know that for taxpayers to be able to have credit, there needs to be the payment of the previous phase. I don't know if this changed, but you can see this is a discussion that has already been even overcome in the Supreme Court. They've already faced this discussion in regards to PIS/COFINS, and even in regards to income tax for individuals. So, okay, to use the credit of the taxes that were paid previously, will I need to have the payment of the taxes paid in the previous phase? No, because it's you're right. From the moment when you reopen this kind of discussion, new judicial demands will come up. So, Caio, I believe that answering your question, in my perspective, yes, there's more complexity, and we'll have like 5 taxes with all the complexity that we currently have. As Vanessa mentioned, we had to also correct this in parallel. At least that's what I understood. But of course, there is a need to correct this. And at the same time, we will have the creation of a 7th tax. So going back here, the electronic invoice is fundamental for any kind of model. And the complementary law for ISS was left with this electronic invoice, and we need to be able to offer this to all of the taxpayers. So with this electronic, we have a 4.5 in the GDP. You can solve this. In regards to the ICMS, the challenges in regards to exports, especially in regards to the ICMS, would be solved and avoid future problems that we have in Europe. The eliminate of the so this must be solved. So Rio Grande do Sul is a state that has a silent reform, and of course we're not going to be able to solve all the problems initially, but the response will be in the short and mid-term, and this is what's most important. You need to reestablish investments here in Brazil, jobs, income. This is essential because we have a lot of people that are being left along the road. So I'm afraid that it'll take too long to implement these measures, and this transition will certainly only happen in about 2 or 3 years. So, Caio, just 1 more minute. We'll have some more challenges in this legislation. So we need to have measures in this legislation. We need to simplify the calculation basis due to the international accounting. We're already going to have some administrative disputes, and this must be corrected. So we can't wait for a huge event to be implemented and then after discuss other matters. No, it's urgent, necessary to face points that are already discussed and identified in the business environment. I'm so sorry if I've gone over time a bit. I think we're here for this debate. And it's very important to have some similar perspectives, different opinions. On the other hand, I think this is how we can lead to greater maturity in our debate. Now I will pass on the word to Vanessa and ask her about this process to lead to greater maturity. I remember that when we were with the ministry, we participated in some meetings with sectors that were very concerned with the reform. Normally, these are sectors that have some kind of a specific benefit or some special regime. I remember the teams from milk production and construction, books. There was just a recent debate as well. So the closest or farthest we are, how close or how far are we at reaching some kind of a convergence? How mature is society for this kind of debate? And I'm sure many sectors are concentrating, are searching for you to have this kind of clarification. Well, I think it's a huge evolution. Although we can't, maybe I can't see the discussion of the tax reform being only involving some economic issues that would ignore legal issues or issues that are merely legal. I think that the market maybe does not want to hear the semantic discussions that legal representatives like to get lost in. But I believe that there is a connection, especially the use of the international experience with as major ingredients that really enrich the debate. So I think that opening up the perspective, the mindset of people that are dealing with public policies, lawyers, institutions, and major authorities always participate in this kind of process to other perspectives, to pros and cons. I think that the debate was a lot more superficial. And this was primarily due to law schools that were always focusing on tax structures in a very alienated manner. Also not looking at tax administrative issues and economy. So I think there's a self-criticism here that we've always prepared people in schools that were not prepared for such a deep level of discussion as we have currently. So this could be temporary. I'm not sure if it's going to be long term, but the quality of the discussions in the private sector with the public sector improved a lot. So I believe that maybe this kind of logic that Hashiji may have experienced where, so look, my tax load is going to increase. And so the impact of this tax reform is very negative to us. Well, I say, look, we need a little more data here, because theoretically, if the tax load is the same, and that means we have under tax payments. So should we maintain the tax load is already pretty high, but I think that if everyone loses, I don't know who's paying more currently. So of course, we're going to have a rebalancing process of the load. And I believe that this is something that's more difficult for sectors to understand, but the quality of the discussion and saying, look, it's not necessarily the tax system that's going to solve our competitive advantage issues, or maybe fiscal incentives will not be the ones solving the sectors of health, education, agro. Tax incentives are not going to reduce inequality. So tax incentives are not going to create opportunities necessarily in jobs and all of that. I think the shift in the logic that the state should help the economy through differentiated treatment is a logic that took a long time to be understood in Brazil, and it transformed the system into what it is. currently. And I think that finally the discussion changed in levels. So from the perspective of public policy, I believe that this discussion that we're having now with productivity and economic growth, simplicity, as well as international experience in a more homogeneous manner. And I believe that this is something we will not lose. I actually have a lot of meetings with the Receita Federal, the Internal Revenue Service, and I've seen that the actual team is very prepared to discuss this with the private sector. Actually, even saying, look, we've been working with you for 15 years, and if you were not able to do this up until now by the same logic, maybe we need to think about what's the real problem with your sector, and maybe address this in other ways. So this is a major gain in public policy in Brazil that we should not lose. So no doubt this alignment between reviewing tax exemptions and incentives, as well as improvements that can align the constitution and with economic principles and international experience will lead us to where we want to get to. We want to have a good environment system. We want to have a legal security, competitive approach, investment, and economic growth. But if we wake up, if we can agree upon a diagnosis, and I think this is what needs to change. Lots of people have solutions, but no one wants to actually study the problem. And then, of course, you're never going to reach an agreement because each one has their own vision. So I think what we've been working on a lot with the Internal Revenue Service and the economic environment and the Secretary of Economic and other ministries like agriculture and regional development is gathering data and experience so that we can have a good diagnosis. What is the main problem of agribusiness in Brazil, for example? When we reach an agreement of this problem with data from different players, we'll be able to understand what's the solution in the short and mid and long run. Maybe we can attack it in the long run. So then we have a lot of solutions that will be substituted in the standard solution, which is a differentiated regime in the tax system. So I have very difficult discussions and it's natural that they will be reacting a lot, maintaining their special regimes due to the current regime, but they can't take a look at the new system. And maybe we have agreed upon, not only with the sector, but others as well, about let's agree on what's your problem, what's your challenge, and what's your insecurity, because then after we can build the solution, looking at the short, mid, and long-term effects. So of course, this is never a frustration with the effective advance in this change.
The particular needs of the country. We can do this. The logistics, production, and the consumption questions. How do you see this from the point of view of maturity? If we're really at the moment of going forward,
concordo com a Vanessa. Acho que a qualidade das políticas públicas, do debate sobre políticas públicas brasileiras melhorou bastante nos últimos anos. Eu quero falar assim, melhorou em relação ao tempo que eu estava no governo, de forma clara. Eu acho que a qualidade hoje está melhor, não só pela atuação do governo, mas pela própria atuação da academia e de outras pessoas. Acho que a gente tem hoje debate mais sobre políticas públicas.
Public policies.
Quando a gente entra na questão de tratamentos setoriais ou regionais diferenciados, o que a gente vê são duas questões. Vamos falar dos setores primeiro. O que a gente propõe de regime uniforme para todos os setores, na PEC 45, não tem nada de original. Nada.
45 is nothing original.
It's
just a recommendation, international recommendation.
Não tem nada de original, nada.
There's nothing original. There's nothing new.
Motivos para isso.
There's a lot of reasons for that.
Você tem diferenciação, automaticamente você tem um problema
This
da classificação,
differentiation
e a classificação traz
is the
custo
classification
burocrático e traz contencioso.
of
É imediato. Só para você ter uma ideia, o fisco
Just to
da
give you an
Suécia,
idea.
a Suécia tem 3 alíquotas positivas de IVA, 3. Eles estimaram que na Suécia, onde a propensão ao litígio é muito menor que no Brasil,
think about
que
a
a
lot
adoção
smaller
de
than
uma
in
alíquota só
Brazil.
reduziria em 30% o custo de compliance de
It
pagar o IVA
reduced
na Suécia.
30% the cost of
Imagina no
compliance.
Brasil, você multiplicar isso por
Imagine a
mínimo por
Brazil.
5, tá certo? É uma coisa assim
It's something that
impressionante.
is impressive.
Segundo,
Secondly,
alíquotas uniformes,
the rates, uniform rates
elas não são mais eficientes, elas são mais justas.
are
No
not
Brasil,
more
hoje,
efficient. They're more
o
fair.
consumo
Today,
dos ricos é menos tributário que
the
o consumo dos
consumption
pobres. Porque
of the
serviço
consumption
é
of
menos
rich people
tributado
is
que
less
mercadoria.
taxed than the consumption of the poor.
Contando com a desoneração da cesta básica.
With so much
Tem pelo menos
taxes
2
on
estudos que mostram isso
on the
de forma
basic
clara. E
food
quantifica. O
basket,
efeito não é enorme, mas existe.
has an enormous
Então, deveria ser
effect.
o oposto. Então, no
But it should be
Brasil,
the
a gente
opposite. In
serviço
Brazil,
paga menos imposto que mercadoria, mas serviço quem consome é rico. E
we
o IVA,
don't
o
tax
IBS,
the
é um
rich.
imposto sobre o consumo.
We
Por que
only
o consumo
tax
do
the
rico tem que ser
consumption.
menos tributário que o consumo do pobre?
Why should we
Honestamente, não tem
tax the
razão,
consumption
não tem
of the
razão de ser,
poor?
entendeu? É falha de desenho no sistema.
We talk about
no
a design of the
sistema
system, of the tax
Então,
system.
finalmente, eu acho que a questão que a gente tem
Possibly,
que
the
colocar
question that we have to
nesse debate,
place
eu acho que está
on the
melhorando,
table,
acho que a gente tem mais
I think it's
condições,
improving.
inclusive esse
I think we
debate
have
técnico ajuda na
possibilities.
política hoje,
This,
mais do que ajudava
we
no passado.
more than we had in the
Tá
past.
certo?
We have a possibility of going
Talvez
forward.
o fato de que não tem mais
The fact
financiamento de
that-
empresa para campanha eleitoral também ajude,
That we don't have
mas o fato é
businesses
que o debate
financing
técnico
electoral
hoje está sendo
campaigns.
mais ouvido no parlamento, tem
So I
mais
think
força
that the technicians
na
are being
discussão
more
no
heard
parlamento.
in the Congress
E eu acho que a questão
rather
de ter
than
colocado
just the
setores,
lobbyists.
primeiro que os
But
setores, quando
the
fazem, vem falar,
sectors,
pagam no setor, geralmente eles fazem a conta errada. Eles olham um pedaço da conta e não
they
olham
talk
todo.
about part of the
Quase
deal,
sempre
but not
vem a conta
everything.
errada.
But always
E segundo,
touching
é
on the
olhar e falar
wrong
assim,
points.
olha, não é se eu vou pagar mais ou menos tributo, eu vou
It's
ganhar
not
ou
I'm
vou
going to pay
perder
more or
com a
less
reforma
tax.
tributária. E como eu falei, os nossos estudos mostram que todos
As
os
I
setores
mentioned,
ganham.
our studies clearly
Todos os
show
setores
that.
ganham. É um jogo de soma positiva, não é um jogo de
It's a
soma zero.
it's a positive
E
sum.
isso é absolutamente fundamental para a gente colocar
And this
nesse
is
debate.
absolutely important for
Finalmente,
us to
queria só
place
falar
on
uma
the
coisa de
table
novo
during
com o
this
Rashid
debate.
aqui. Rashid,
As Rashid
eu
mentioned,
acho que a agenda de mudanças
I think the
infraconstitucionais
agenda
ela não é
of change
alternativa à reforma tributária,
there's
ela é
no
complementar.
alternative
Imposto de
to
renda,
this.
concordo 100% com você, é matéria infraconstitucional, lei ordinária.
Income tax, I agree with you
Vamos fazer, dá
100%.
para fazer. O que der para fazer com lei ordinária, vamos fazer.
What we
Mas
can
se
do
tem
through
condição
ordinary
de fazer
laws,
uma
we should
reforma
do.
constitucional
But to make a
que melhore
constitutional
enormemente a
reform,
tributação
which
de
would
bens e serviços, por que
made
não
a
fazer?
great deal of
Elas são
improvement
complementares, elas
in
não
the
são,
taxation of
elas
goods
não
and
são
services.
contraditórias entre si.
These are
Eu acho que é isso que nós temos
contradictory
que entender
goals.
nesse debate.
So that's what we have to look at in this debate. Very good. Thank you, Abi. I was thinking there's the theory of the Laffer curve. By the more you increase the rate, you increase income, but at a certain point you raise the rate and the collection goes down, because when you collect 100%, nobody produces anything. All of the economic sectors of the economy, I learned this in the government, I think they're all on the bottom side of the Laffer curve. If you lower it, I have a study, if you lower my rate, your income will go way up, tax income will go way up. Everybody always thinks they're on the far side of the Laffer curve. We're getting to the end of our time. We have 3 more minutes to close our debate. So I wanted to ask you each, starting with Rashid, then to Vanessa, and then to Api, to give a final consideration. Thank you all deeply for your participation, of all 3 of you, in this debate, which is absolutely fundamental for the productivity of the Brazilian economy. And I'm sure that if the debate is better today, it's because you, people like you, are becoming more a bigger part of the public debate, writing more, contributing more, and this is very important. So I want to thank all of you in the name of XP Investments, and I wanted to thank you for your final considerations. I think I have to agree with both of you, because it was a very rich debate in the recent years. Talking about tax, everybody has to participate. You can't just have one part of the economy that talks about it, because the impact is very big. It concerns me a lot when you place systems and propose a model to have only one tax rate. imagine health being taxed at 30%, but we don't have time to talk about that right now. What I want to do is thank you all very much for the presence of the audience who are watching to debate with you, with Vanessa and Bernardo. Thank you once again for being with us. And we all have the proposition of improving things and increase investments in our country here. Thank you, Vanessa. I want to thank you that I know what you go through. Now I know what you go through, and I don't know how you were able to be able to stand what you had to go through, to be able to do this debate with the private sector in these important bases. I think it was maybe what Bernard said when he says the same thing for the last 10 years. They've been saying the same thing. I was speaking to the minister yesterday, this opportunity, this dialogue that we're having, especially for me, brings a great deal, a great gain in exchange of ideas, of growth. And as I said, independent of our divergencies, of our differences, which reflect different needs of the society, which are not different from ours. Each one has a different reading of the difficulties and of the concerns that society brings up in a complex question like this. At least in the objectives, as we said, we're all in line. We all want a society where taxation is more fair, be less hostile to companies, so that they can have a social contribution of generating income, increase productivity, improving the economy for everyone. So I'm very happy. I think it was a very nice debate. Thank you for the formation of the panel, Caio, for you and XP. Thank you very much. And I'm going to leave here. I think people will leave here thinking a little bit more. Thank you very much. And thank you. It was a pleasure. The pleasure was ours. Bernard?
Eu queria agradecer o convite. Acho que os debates
I wanted to thank you for the invitation. The debate was fundamental, even when we have differences.
Eu admiro muito o Rashid como gestor, senhor gestor.
I had to think of Rashid as a manager, a very important manager,
como formuladora.
Experience, and he was my.
Eu acho que o debate é fundamental.
I think the debate is fundamental. And we can go forward.
Educação e
saúde,
Rashid, se a gente tributar a classe média com
how about
rico
if we tax the middle class 25% instead of 30%?
Sobre a alíquota, no particular, depois a gente acerta os termos da
I think we can talk about the details later.
Eu tenho muita confiança de que a gente vai fazer certo. Tá bom, a gente convida para tomar o vinho.
Participate in the who's going to decide who wants to participate in paying for the wine. That will be the result of our discussion. Thank you very much. Good night to everyone. It was a very rich debate. I'm going to pass it back over to Clara for the continuation of our event. Thank you very much. Thank you, Caio. Thank you very much. I believe she has her microphone muted. Tá mutada. There we go. She had her microphone muted.
Oi, pessoal.
Okay, hello everybody.
Queria agradecer imensamente a presença dos nossos convidados, enriquecendo esse debate.
Invited guests.
O áudio.
Continuing, now that I've got my audio back.
Começar o segundo painel, eu comentei sobre a importância da diversificação.
I want to talk about the importance of conversation. It's come to reinforce this idea.
Cenário global, vemos o protagonismo da corrida da vacina,
the protagonism of these
e no Brasil essas incertezas elas se unem com a necessidade de reformas que garantam a capacidade de honrar nossa dívida.
The capacity to honor our debts.
Eu,
we also
a minha
have to continue.
Eu sou assessora de investimentos.
I'm an assistant, an investment assistant. In XP, you can count with our assistants when it's time to set up your portfolio for 2021. Take advantage of this content, all of these things, taking advantage of our assistants to set up a portfolio which will be appropriate for you. For our panel for economy, in the second panel, we talked about public policy and private policy. And we closed the last panel talking about tax reform. I'm going to the final panel, which will show the way forward for these reforms in Congress. So we had the leader of the government in the Camera, Excelentíssimo Ricardo Barros. Welcome to our event, Deputy Ricardo. Thank you. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I listened to the end of the last debate, which was very qualified, the theme that they're debating. Of the reform, the tributary reform, tax reform, and I'm very excited to be able to put this forward immediately in Congress.
Para fazer a mediação desse debate, teremos nossos dois analistas da XP,
we have our two,
Gama e o Paulo Gama.
Paulo Gama and
Boa
Júnia
noite,
Gama, our
Júnia e
analysts
Paulo.
from XP. Paulo and Júnia, good night, good evening, good evening. Clara, Deputado Ricardo, Paulo, and good night to all of us, to each one.
Boa noite, deputado. Boa noite, Júnia. Boa noite, Clara.
Good evening,
boa noite a todos que estão nos acompanhando
Júnia,
aqui.
Everybody who's accompanying us here online.
Vamos chamar a vinheta e eles
We're now going to
começam
call
logo
for
na
our
sequência.
vignette, and we'll start the debate right after that.
Boa noite, deputado.
Evening,
boa noite, Júnia. Boa noite a todos que nos escutam.
Everybody who's listening.
Deputado, primeiro, em nome da XP,
Deputado, first of all, in the name of
reitero aqui as
XP
palavras da Clara,
Investments,
agradeço a
I
sua
wanted
presença,
to
para a gente vai
repeat
ser um
Clara's
prazer
words. Thank you for your
poder
presence. It's a
debater com o
tremendous
senhor
pleasure
aqui,
to have you here with us
olhar
this
aí o
evening.
caminho das reformas. A gente tem
Looking at
muita
the
coisa
way
para
forward for
discutir
the
sobre
reforms.
2021,
We have lots
que é
to
o tema
discuss about
da nossa
2021.
conversa, mas eu
The
queria
theme
me
of our
permitir
conversation tonight.
começar falando sobre
But if you
2020
permit,
ainda.
I want to
O senhor
talk a
disse
little bit
ainda na
about
introdução
2020
que
still.
espera ali ver se consegue nesse
And
finalzinho
what we
de ano
see, what we
ainda
expect at
votar
this end of
no
the
plenário
year
da Câmara a
to
reforma
vote
tributária.
in
Então eu
the
queria lhe
House of
fazer essa primeira
Representatives
pergunta, aproveitando o
the tax
tema
reform.
ali do nosso último
First
painel, a gente
first
viu a
question
importância desse
of our
assunto,
last
enfim, para
panel,
o crescimento
the
do país,
importance
para a
of this
retomada dos
question
empregos, para a
for the
simplificação,
growth of
enfim,
for
de
the
quem
reduction of
empreende e
unemployment,
tudo mais.
creating new
Eu queria lhe
jobs.
perguntar, deputado, como é que estão as conversas
How are
sobre
the
a reforma tributária? A
conversations
gente sabe
about tax
que
reform?
existiu ali em algum momento
We
uma
know that
vontade
there
do
was
presidente Rodrigo Maia de construir um texto
an important
diferente do
thing
texto
of
que era
Rodrigo
pretendido
Maia,
pelo Ministério
different
da
from the text,
Economia e pelo
which was
governo.
the Ministry
Recentemente ele
of
voltou a
the
dizer que
Economy's
estava contando
text.
votos ali, conversando com
He
alguns
was counting
partidos
for
de
votes,
esquerda
talking to
para ver
some
se chegava aos
parties of the
308
left to
votos
see if we could come
necessários.
up with the necessary votes
Enfim, o
to
governo está
bring
dentro
forward
dessa
a different
discussão, o governo
proposal.
vai
The
trabalhar pela
government's in
aprovação
this
dessa proposta ainda em 2020.
The
Obrigado
government
mais
will
uma
work on
vez,
this
deputado,
proposal.
pela participação e pela
Thank you
presença.
once again for your participation and your presence. Paulo, it's a pleasure. In fact, we are interested in approving the tax reform. It's one of the priorities of the government to approve the administrative reform and the tax reform. But we have also on the agenda, which we're setting up for P 101, renegotiation of debts with states and municipalities, and the lack of in the public accounting numbers. We have to speak with President Rodrigo Maia, President of the Cámara, Rodrigo Maia, afterwards to discuss if we're going to advance a great deal. We want to vote for tax reform. However, we have to wait to be able to very quickly bring this forward with Rodrigo Maia in putting negotiation and with our assistance of the government, and to have a consensus to be able to vote at least the first vote this year. It's a target that is very bold, but we may be able to get there. It's a bold goal, but we hope to get there. Good evening. I'm going to take advantage and jump on Paulo's question, follow up on Paulo's question. We know that Rodrigo Maia is negotiating with parties from the left, the formation of a bloc for his succession as president of the House of Representatives. What do you think about the decision of the Supremo of the High Court yesterday, how it could affect the government? But since we're talking about tax reform, I wanted to know these parties from the left make a point of including certain themes to give a progressive tendency to that tax reform law. They talk about large fortunes, profits and dividends, inheritances, themes that the left, to support this proposal, wants to include in tax reform. Rodrigo Maia is negotiating with them. he would be favorable to some of these themes. And I want to know, what's the government's position? Can these points, could the reforms get stuck on these points? And if not, what else would be able to stop the reform from going forward at this time? They're more for ruining rather than blocking. We're interested in advancing. I don't know the text, so it's difficult to respond the different conditions. But I hope by tomorrow, Wednesday, to have a clear idea of what they're proposing in their report, discuss with the government, find out their position, and who knows, maybe reach an agreement on a text which would be agreeable to all for voting in this in the first vote. It's an important point, because to talk about the tax reform, and just as was the Social Security reform and the labor reform, we also have to worry about COVID, sanitation, many things that have come up during this period. And we hope that now, at the end of the day of your question, we'll be able to advance even more. I'm very confident. However, I can't go into that level of detail because I haven't
Líder,
been
eu vou
able to see the text
aproveitar
yet.
também que a
Let
Júnia
me take
mencionou
advantage of Junior's
a
question,
sucessão, para lhe perguntar o
succession,
quanto é que essa
to
agenda
ask
já tem
how
interferido na
much has this
dinâmica de
agenda
votações
interfered in
da
the
Câmara.
dynamic of
Hoje, como o senhor
votes
mencionou, a gente está
in the
votando
House.
O projeto de lei com novas regras para cabotagem, um
You're
projeto
voting the
importante que o
new
governo
rules for
tentava há bastante
coastal
tempo
shipping,
ali colocar em pauta,
which has
mas
been a
justamente
long time
houve
to
um
be voted
atraso
on
ali, me
the
parece um
list.
pouco
Long
por
time
conta
there's
das
been
divergências
a
em
delay
função
due
da
to
Comissão Mista de
divergencies
Orçamento, né, que já
in
refletia um
the
pouco desse clima da
Budget
sucessão.
Committee
Então,
and
queria
the
uma
climate of
avaliação do
succession.
senhor
So I wanted to hear
sobre o
your
quanto a
evaluation.
sucessão do Rodrigo Maia
How
já é um
much
tema
Rodrigo
dominante na
Maia's
Câmara
succession is
esse ano e
dominating
o quanto isso tem
the
interferido
House
aí na
this year,
agenda
and how
de
much this has
votação do governo.
interfered in the vote, in the agenda of votes that the government like to vote. I think that we've had a paralyzation of the agenda, much more due to the municipal elections than due to internal divergencies in the House. The fact that we have this plan of the budget is due to various factors. One is there was not an agreement for the presidency of the commission, but the most important disagreement was that we had a lack of interest on the part of parliamentarians in being nominated to the commission. A law that I authored that had all of the concern of the budget, that after you've participated for 1 year in the commission, couldn't participate the following year. So whoever has been entered in the last few days would not be able to participate again. So the lack of interest on the members of the House to be a member of the commission for just a few days of work, and the decision of the president that would the NDO, the budget law for expenses in January and February to participate in the budget occurred. It occurred that the presidency would no longer be in the commission, in the budget commission. It will be up until the last Tuesday of March, which will be the commission this year. But after January, we can name the new commission, of new budget commission, looking for members to look in the House and in the Senate to begin the debates on the votes in the commission and vote both budgets for 20 and 21 at the same time. This is a reality that is possible, and it should be the fruit of negotiation. But Senator Eduardo Gomes, it's not my responsibility. The installation of this commission belongs to Senator Eduardo Gomes. In the House, yes, we're stuck in. We want to get it voted. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this decision of the Supreme Court to reseat the election in the Congress. In the Senate, we had a scenario of relative tranquility with the government. The president, Columbri, had over his time a friendly posture. He had no difficulties to make the government's agenda to advance. He had a good dialogue with the government. And then next year, we don't know what the scenario will be. There are other candidates from the PMDB, the biggest party, but also other parties, PSDB, perhaps some candidate from the opposition. And in the House, we didn't expect that Rodrigo Maia would be a candidate again, but now there was a doubt, but now it became clear that he won't be. But in any event, it changes the political game for succession in the House. So let me ask, Arthur Hilio is seen as a candidate of the government, even though we don't see the government acting directly in this dispute, distributing ministries or posts or taking obstacles out of the way. You think that the government, starting now with the decision of the Supreme Court, will enter more directly to hold an ally into the presidency of the House and of the Senate, so that these next 2 years will be so crucial for the government to make some reforms so that the economy can be stable, at least stable? First of all, as far as the decision of the Supreme Court, since I voted for that amendment, which made it clear that it was prohibited to have the re-election in the same candidate, in the same government, the Supreme Court saw what was written. As far as the political merit, I won't comment because I have said I will not interfere in the election in the House or in the Senate, because these are independent houses. Up until the present moment, all of the presidential candidates, the possible candidates for the presidency of the House, are from the government base, so there's no risk to the agenda of reforms that we should be voting. In the Senate, we'll see the names that will be presented. So I don't see any need for the government to enter into the dispute in the House or in the Senate, except for the personal problems of the President of the Republic. See how things will happen. Since we don't yet know, I don't see how to comment if this is necessary or not, an operation of the government at this moment. As a thesis, in principle, I think the government should get involved in the election for the presidency of the House and the Senate, and it will very probably, the alternatives they're all good alternatives for the agenda of the government.
Lhe preocupa de alguma maneira esse
Are you worried in any way this movement that Rodrigo Maia has made
de buscar os
with
votos
his
da
group
esquerda
of seeking votes from the left
Quer dizer, a
for
gente
this election?
imagina ali o grupo do presidente Rodrigo Maia,
You
tem
imagine the group of the
perto ali dos
president,
seus 100
Rodrigo Maia,
deputados,
has about
enfim, um pouco maior ali do Centrão, e a
deputies,
esquerda tem também
with the
perto de 100,
center and the
130
left has another
deputados, mais ou
100 or
menos.
130
Parece que vai
deputies.
funcionar ali de alguma maneira como fiel
They
da
can
balança
operate
ali
as
para a decisão
a
do
weight
presidente
that
em
will
fevereiro.
decide the
Preocupa o
decision in
governo
February.
que o
Is
próximo
the government
presidente tenha
concerned
sido
that the
eleito
next
com apoio da
president
esquerda?
will be have
Quer dizer, vocês
elected
já
with the
veem
support of the
nessas
left?
conversas do presidente
Have you,
Rodrigo Maia
in
algum
your
reflexo sobre a
your
pauta? O que
conversations
dá para,
with Rodrigo
assim,
Maia
quem
been
está nos
discussing
escutando,
the
que
agenda?
costuma
Are
olhar
they-
ali
we've heard
privatização
that
da Eletrobras,
the
temas como
privatization of
o marco da
Eletrobras,
cabotagem e outros assuntos
the
setoriais
law
muito
of
importantes.
coastal
Quem está nos ouvindo, como é que
shipping.
deve encarar a
For those who
perspectiva da
are
agenda
listening
econômica
to
a
us,
partir
how
dessas
should we look at
conversas
the economic
que tem
agenda
tido
based
do
on
grupo do
these
presidente Rodrigo Maia com os
conversations
partidos de esquerda?
that the
Que tipo de
Rodrigo Maia group has been
sinal
having with
isso
the
nos dá
left-wing
para
parties
2021?
what will that mean for 2021? It will depend on commitments that the left will demand to support their candidate, his candidacy. It's not clear that the left will go forward with him in this election. It's not clear to me that the formation of the blocs has been clearly defined. I believe that the fact that the president, Rodrigo Maia, is only one among his supporters could cause a confusion among his followers, but it could cause such a thing. It's very recent. This new situation is brand new. It just happened today. Colombia will arrive in Brasilia. We'll still have conversations, which he will lead regarding the succession in the Senate, and who will then be a very influential voice in the succession in the Senate. And President Rodrigo Maia, who has won 3 times with the support of the left. So this is something that he understands. He knows how to utilize it. He knows that the best the caution that we can all have now is to respect the competence of the political actors who are working on these projects for the command of the Senate and the House, because these are very relevant positions, very important for Brazil, and all of us are rooting that whatever the result might be, that it will be a reformer who will be qualified by the courage to vote the agendas that Brazil needs to advance in. Is there an expectation that the government will promote some changes in among the ministries at the beginning of next year? And then certainly, which would also work to compose this chessboard in the Senate and in the House. What do we have in the way of perspectives for these changes? We speak about 2 ministers that are always cited as potential candidates in this dispute. Minister Faria of Communication and Teresa Cristina of Agriculture. How are the conversations? What are the expectations that we might have at this as the new year comes in for changes in the ministries? President Bolsonaro has clearly a clear position. He will not deliver ministries to the parties. I don't think he will change that position. The fact that we have 2 ministers that are good ministers, that are Dem from the Dem party, that we will not exchange these ministers, is the clearest proof that these ministries are not to be used as pieces for exchange for votes. I don't think he's going to change his behavior. I wouldn't like to see that. If he changes a minister because he's not satisfied with his performance of that minister and not due to some political need, which is a different way, a different type of conduct, then otherwise I wouldn't bet on this solution. We're looking at a team that's making results. If there are any difficulties, they won't make any drastic changes with the objective of overcoming the government base, because he already has a base. And he doesn't need to swap ministries in order to obtain
Líder, acho que para concluir aqui o nosso bloco de perguntas sobre a sucessão agora, há um entendimento, pelo menos ali nas declarações mais recentes do presidente, prefeito ACM Neto, de que o partido não tende a caminhar com o presidente Jair Bolsonaro em 2022. É a mesma coisa a gente vê nesse grupo mais de centro, digamos assim, que se juntou na eleição municipal de São Paulo, fez alguns movimentos país afora nessas eleições municipais. Causa algum tipo de preocupação ao governo, a condução que essa agenda vai ter, caso o presidente da Câmara eleito venha a ser de partido desse bloco? Sei que o senhor mencionou que todos são reformistas que demonstraram boa vontade com a agenda de reformas do governo nesse período, mas com a proximidade da eleição de 2022, o biênio agora é que vai ser decisivo, me parece, para as perspectivas de eleição do presidente Bolsonaro. Que tipo de cuidado o governo pode tomar nesse período para evitar justamente que a eleição de 2022 contamine esses 2 anos e que a gente seja justamente impedido de avançar com reforma por conta das eleições presidenciais de 2022.
First of all, the government has a base already with this group that's already established. When you talk about this block with the idea of Dória running for PSDB is not in the government's base, but they vote with us all of the materials of reforms, with almost all of the integrity of their group. The Democratas and the PMDB are parties that do not have a defined position. Depending on the new political geography which is established, and if the president maintains his prestige in the North and Northeast, which he now has, I think that there could be, the Democratas or the PMDB could evaluate the possibility of joining the president in his re-election campaign. The progressives have already announced that they will be with the president in his re-election. Other parties are evaluating their situation. But the MDB is a federation of regional leaderships that are very, very strong. Sarney, Jucá, Jair de Barba, Renan Calheiros. These are leaders who don't have to answer to any central leader. They have their own agenda. And so, in the same way, the Democratas party of Columbri and Magalhães Neto, the president of the party, the leader of the party, are very susceptible to pressure, political pressure, in the case that there's the maintenance of the position of Bolsonaro in these regions. It's being clearly defined, and it will depend a great deal on the political capacity of the president, starting with last Monday when the municipal elections ended and the succession election for 2022 began in the Congress, and we start to vote, set up the political articulation of his government in the direction of the center of a consensus, which is, I think, what will happen. I would like you to deepen a little bit this vision for us. ACM Neto gave an interview saying that you could not give up completely his support of the DEM to Bolsonaro in 2022. But this, of course, since the president moves closer to the center, to move away from the extremists. For instance, the position of the president in relation to the environment, the conflicts with China. Do you think that knowing the president and being his leader in the government, will the president be able to, over this period of time that he still has in his government, will be more careful in terms of these questions? Can we expect more tranquility in as he conducts these themes? Just yesterday or the day before yesterday, he reaffirmed the presence of Ricardo Salles in the Ministry of the Environment, an indication that he does not plan to make any changes in the policy which he's been conducting in the area of the environment. I think that President Bolsonaro is clear in what direction he should walk to be able to guarantee his reelection. He has a lot of followers a lot of appreciation in the social networks. He appreciates those who brought him to power as president. He knows how many votes he had from that group, which we call the right, the conservatives. He knows how much support he had against the PT, the Workers' Party, with the rejection of their agenda to not let the PT come back into power. And there's also a group of people who are neutral, let's say, who evaluate the situation, the perspectives, the behavior of the government, its realizations, to understand its positions in the re-election. At the moment, the president, there is no adversary that could stand up to him, who is presented with enough votes, capacity for articulation, political articulation, to be able to challenge the president. However, many will look for that space, and one or two or three adversaries will come up in this coming process who may be able to confront the president with capacity to dispute this election. But at this moment, there is no such name. So the president will take advantage of this moment and work on the aggregation of this leadership of his succession. So as we said, as ACM Neto says, he can't always walk towards the left. This is what should happen, because it's a common sense of how to conduct the process of succession. For instance, you talked about, if you understand that this is the way forward, then he could put together the parties which are not part of his spectrum. and to be together for the succession.
Líder, eu queria mudar um pouquinho o assunto
I want to
e
change a
entrar
little
num
bit the
dos temas
subject
que traz
and go
mais
into a theme which
ansiedade,
brings
vamos
more,
dizer assim,
more
ao
anxiety
mercado e ao público que está nos
to the
acompanhando por
public
aqui,
who are
que
listening
são
to
as
us here,
questões fiscais.
which
A
are the
gente viu
fiscal
hoje o mercado
issues.
reagiu
Today we saw the
negativamente ali
market
ao que saiu como
reacted
um
negatively
pedaço do relatório do Márcio
when
Bitar no
part of
Senado.
the
Ainda é
report
verdade, mas tenho
came out.
certeza de que o senhor acompanha essa
And I'm
discussão,
sure that you've been
porque em
following
breve
this
ela chegará à
discussion
Câmara,
because
mas com a
and soon you'll
perspectiva
be
de que algumas receitas
in the House,
desvinculadas
it'll
pudessem
soon
vir a
be in
ser
the
gastas
House.
fora do teto
I would
de
like you
gastos no
to
ano que vem. Depois ele
since
até soltou uma
outside of
nota dizendo que esse trecho especificamente não
the
constava no
limits,
relatório,
spending
e tudo
limits
mais,
of
mas acho que
next year.
isso ilustra bem aí
However,
a
I think this
preocupação que o mercado
illustrates
tem com a questão
well
fiscal.
the
Diria
concern that the
que
market
talvez
has
a principal
with the fiscal
preocupação
issues
é
as
que a
the
gente vê hoje.
possibly the
Eu queria lhe
principal
perguntar,
concern that
primeiro, se o senhor
they have
acredita
today.
ainda
I
que a
want to ask,
PEC
do you still
emergencial, o
believe
PEC Pacto
that
Federativo,
the constitutional
chegará
amendment
ainda à
of
Câmara
the
esse ano
pact
e
will
se
get
vocês
to
vão
the
ter
House this
condições
year,
de
and
fazer
that it
essa
will be
discussão ainda
possible
esse ano,
to have
ou é
this
algo que a gente
discussion
pode
still
esperar
this year,
para depois
or is
ali
this
da
something that we
eleição
need to
das novas
expect
mesas, né, tanto na Câmara
after the
quanto no
election
Senado?
of the new
E
leadership
chegando,
in
se
the
a gente
House and
tiver essa
Senate?
discussão,
If we have this
é
discussion,
possível descartar a possibilidade
is
de
it
que o
possible
Congresso decida por tirar algum tipo de despesa fora do teto no ano
give
que
up
vem?
the
Ou
idea that
esse é um
the
risco
government
com o
will
qual o
maintain this
governo
for next
convive
year,
e que o
or is this a
governo
risk that the
monitora
government
nessa
has to
discussão?
live with and will continue to monitor in this discussion? The mantra of President Bolsonaro is very clear. You can't. There's no way to continue this war budget. We have to have competence within these limits to find a solution. Senator Marcio is very qualified in his report, and he certainly knows what are the limits that within which he can operate. His report is still a speculation. It's a matter of speculation. But David Columbri has up until the 10th of December to talk about an emergency amendment in case this report is presented as a possibility with consensus for being voted on. And if it's voted on the 10th in the first and second vote, it can go into effect the following week. So we have to see what's going to happen. We have to be clear that the space is very short, or the space of time is very short, and that necessarily that we will have to look at these expenses, we have to control expenses, and that's the way. I don't see any difficulty for Congress to go in that direction, because the first vote with the government was the veto of 17, controlling salaries of public servants until the end of 2021. We had 316 votes, including the PSDB and the PDB, MEDB, because it's not a question of government, it's a question of state. The reforms that we're voting on, tax and administrative reforms, these affect the state, the Brazilian state. And the parties that want to elect governments also want their governors to have their public accounts to be within a balanced tax situation. And that's why they will vote on these texts independent of whether it's a question of the government or not. These questions are state issues, and I think they will have the support of these folks to pass them, to control government expenses.
A gente vê, líder, desculpa emendar mais uma, Júnior, mas a gente vê, às vezes, em conversas com outros congressistas, na Câmara e no Senado, inclusive, uma certa confusão ali sobre a necessidade de conter despesa, como o senhor menciona, com a possibilidade de criar receita. E uma sensação de que, existindo a narrativa de que vai ser neutro, a gente vai criar uma despesa, vai criar uma receita, portanto, a gente pode aprovar uma nova despesa, estaria tudo certo. Como é que a gente consegue evitar? Primeiro, me parece, pela sua fala, que o governo tenta evitar isso. Mas é possível, o senhor acha que, ali, a partir do momento que essa discussão aconteceu, o governo vai, de alguma maneira, perder um pouco do controle desse ponto, e temos o risco ali de passar uma criação de despesa, ainda que com receita para custear. É uma preocupação com a qual a gente tem de conviver, ou está muito claro ali no Congresso, na sua avaliação, que isso não vai acontecer?
So generating revenue is not the solution.
So generating revenue is not, but all of the proposals from Minister Paulo Guedes were neutral from the perspective of tax collection. So the exoneration versus the transactions collecting, but also taxes on dividends and the reduction of the tax fee for legal entities, which was also neutral. So no one is working with this logic of increasing revenue. We're talking about reducing expenses, and within this contention of expenses, finding the necessary fiscal space for the expansion of the social program that will meet the needs of these people that still have not resumed their normal economic activities and that thus need more government support to be able to have income. But we need to have clarity that about 1 million people are returning, giving back their emergency corona voucher, and a lot of them have already resumed their economic activities. And maybe they're receiving the corona voucher, but they don't need it. Well, about the emergency constitutional amendment, we've seen the economy really defending. Even the president of the House of Representatives, Rodrigo Maia, has been defending this measure as fundamental to be able to have greater control over expenses, prioritizing what certainly should be the government's priority in the public budget. And we've seen an attempt in the House of Representatives to connect the Renda Brasil program or Renda Cidadã programs with other measures for public expense cuts, to bring in unpopular measures, but also some more popular measures as well, or more politically sustainable measures. But in the last weeks, we've also seen major efforts from the Ministry of Economy to disconnect this discussion from the emergency constitutional amendment. So even the president said he would give a red card once again to whoever were to talk about the Renda Cidadã program. So I wanted to know if you think that the House of Representatives, as you know it, will approve a emergency constitutional amendment and also other measures for public expense cuts without this kind of counteraction with the creation of an income program that was greater than just the Bolsa Família program. I am convinced that what really will propel the approval of these different measures will definitely be the need of all the political parties and the municipalities and governments and the federal government to really put their finances into order. So what moves this is the need for policies to contain these kind of expenses without the distress of voting on them one by one. So I believe that this is what majorly propels this. If there's some kind of a return or counteraction from Renda Cidadã, that's better. But this kind of fiscal room needs to be found in the day-to-day with the maintenance of public accounts within a reasonability. Brazil for the past 6 years has a primary fiscal deficit, so funding all of the investments. So it's very difficult to continue in this kind of trend. The pandemic just worsened this scenario with a significant increase of the debt GDP level. So I think it's very clear to everyone the need for reforms, and this is what really leads to the possibility of the approval of a constitutional amendment that really has the different mechanisms to contain public expenses. And corporations are very strong and they react violently against any kind of possibility and reduction towards their privileges, and we must have mechanisms to face these. So I'm very confident that the leverages should be approved because they are not a agenda from the government, but from the
Líder,
Brazilian
o
state
Senado
that involves
votando
all
no dia
of
10, como o
the
senhor disse, enfim, tá
political
bastante curto,
parties.
os senadores ainda
So on the
não
10th,
conhecem o
when the
texto
Senate
também, há
is going to vote on
uma
this,
perspectiva de
we
que amanhã
see
na
that
reunião de
senators don't
líderes
even know about
o
the
senador
bill
Fernando
yet,
Bezerra faça o pedido para
and
inclusão na
tomorrow we should
pauta
have
dessa semana,
Fernando Bezerra including this
mas
in the
supondo que o
agenda for the
Senado
week, but
consiga votar
let's
esse
imagine
texto, a
that the
Câmara
Senate
tem
can
tempo
approve
hábil na
this
próxima
text.
semana para fazer essa
Does
votação, quer dizer,
the
o presidente
Parliament have
Rodrigo Maia
time for this
já
kind
tem
of
esse
vote? Does
combinado
President Rodrigo Maia
com
already have this
vocês
kind of
do
agreement with you
governo,
guys?
já há alguma
From
perspectiva
the government, is there some
de
kind of a
data para isso,
perspective
ou
or
a
a
gente
date,
veria
a
isso
time frame
possivelmente
defined
se
for this,
arrastando
or would
talvez para
this
janeiro
maybe
ou para o ano
be
que vem ainda?
extended to January next year? Next week, we will have already scheduled some vetoes from 14 to 18 and then LDO. And then we have up until the 22nd to vote. The quorum here in the parliament is of 500 parliament members. I even tweeted this. I will talk to you guys that we're actually having a nominal voting process now, but I even included this in the in my Twitter account, that the fact that we have been performing voting remotely really favors the approval of a constitutional amendment, because the remote quorum is a lot greater than the on-site quorum. So I think that if there is an adjustment in the bill text, then yes, we can significantly advance with the voting of these measures, as long as, of course, there's a consensus in a preliminary text, and then they can send this to the House of Representatives, and if there's an agreement, we would return. But for us to vote on 2 agendas in the same day, we need to have a general agreement from all of the political parties that are favorable to this matter. So for the tax reform and also the emergency constitutional amendment, they really depend on the talent of the rapporteurs. Well, later you repeated the mantra, we're not going to have the ceiling cuts or war constitutional amendment or the increase of taxes. But we're going to finish the year without the Corona voucher, without a new income program, and the parties involved in these negotiations for the creation of this new program say that from 2021, at least 6 million families are going to be unassisted because they're going to lose the emergency support. We've already have 1 million people on the waiting list for the Bolsa Familia income program. And what is the government actually going to do to solve this matter in the first months of next year, until the House of Representatives can actually approve some kind of a bigger income program that's that can fit into the budget, the public budget? Well, please remember that we're starting off from the principle that we're going to start the year with LDO voted, but without the budget voted on. So we're limited to implement only 1/12 of the budget in the month of January. We don't have much room for maneuvers, but we need to find mechanisms. Minister Onyx Lorenzoni has already approved some microcredit measures to offer to these kind of people, which is not part of the budget. Now they're setting up other kinds of solutions as well, and thinking creatively on how to support these people without necessarily having to have some kind of a relief or lost kind of resources. And I think that there are different possibilities. I've seen some various different alternatives that he presented that seem to be reasonable or feasible. So even though we'll still have to wait for Senator Marcio Bittar with his report on the emergency constitutional amendment, see if there's an understanding about the voting process and if we can solve the matter of the fiscal space necessary to be able to provide this kind of emergency support to these families. But of course, the government needs to be very criteria-based and choose who to help. Because no doubt, a lot of people that received the Corona voucher did not need these amounts, no doubt.
Líder, na semana que vem, como o senhor mencionou, está prevista votação no Congresso de vários assuntos, LDO entre eles, mas também há uma série de vetos presidenciais que vão ser analisados
that are going to
dos
be
vetos aqui que o
analyzed. And one of
mercado
the vetoes
presta bastante
is
atenção
that the market
são
pays
os vetos
attention to a
ao
lot, are the
projeto do
vetoes related
saneamento,
to the
enfim, que houve uma conversa
sanitation
para que eles fossem
program. There was a
votados no
conversation for them
início
to
de
be voted
novembro, acabaram
on
ficando
in the
fora por
beginning
acordo,
of
por conta
November,
de
and then
demanda
they were
dos
left out
senadores,
due to
e há uma
demand.
perspectiva de que eles
But now
voltem à
there's a
pauta
perspective that they
agora na
would be
semana que vem.
returning to the
O
agenda
governo está confiante para fazer essa
next
votação, o
week. Is
Senado
the
vai conseguir de
government
novo adiar o
confident
pedido
about
por
this
acordo.
voting
O
process?
veto,
Will the
esse
Senate be
começa
able to
a ser
extend
votado
this?
pela Câmara, mas na última vez os senadores conseguiram
Last time the
forçar ali
senators
que o
were
governo
able to
tirasse da
force
pauta, né?
the
O veto
government
para
to
que ele não fosse
remove this
mantido.
veto from the agenda.
O Senado está com essa força de novo, vai conseguir
Does the
tirar da
Senate have
pauta
this kind of
ou a
strength once
perspectiva é
again,
de manutenção
or is
dele
the
na semana que vem?
perspective that will remain maintaining this next week? Here in the House of Representatives, I've checked everyone that participated in the negotiations for this bill, and there's not a commitment from the government and any government leaders in the House of Representatives to maintain the removal of this veto that extends for 30-year informal contracts between municipalities and state-owned companies for sanitation. If there is a possibility of a nominal voting process, I will work intensely to maintain the veto in the House of Representatives. It could be that this veto is part of a package of agreements. And in this case, if there's not the nominal voting process, we would not be able to perform or convince Parliament members in the House of Representatives that this veto must be maintained, and that this extension is not good for Brazil or any of the other municipalities involved. Well, we've heard from some different sources from the government the thesis that the government would try to go back on the veto of the exoneration, but they would like to first maintain the veto on sanitation. Is the government actually going to try to go back on this? Will they wait for the voting of this veto of sanitation? And isn't that going to be a little tight? The companies that would be exonerated would be charged for taxes. Well, all of the companies have a tax relief until December 31st, but then after this, the government needs to implement once again this exoneration. The implementation of the exoneration, according to the Tribunal de Contas da União, depends on the government really implementing some public expense cut representing 4 billion rands, or an increase of revenue that represents 4 billion rands, which I don't think will be happening. So the applicability of the law may be compromised due to a lack of fulfillment of the fiscal liability law. So this is what I believe will be happening, because these are the main reasons for the veto, and also the opinion of the TCU, which even on the voting day tweeted that there was not coverage for any kind of public expense cuts or increases of revenue for this kind of exoneration. And so I believe that the AGU will discuss this and provoke the discussion on this, because they proposed the veto and the main reasons for this, and they must thus take on some provisions in this sense. And so in regards to the veto of sanitation measures, I've never heard about this possibility. But this is all related to the leadership from Senator Eduardo Gomes, and I'm actually giving him some opinions in his area that I should not be talking about.
Era vice-líder no Congresso,
but before you're a leader in the House of Representatives, you're the vice leader.
Então, pelo que o senhor diz,
and you've been monitoring these discussions a lot, but by what you said, even if the government does not request an analysis by the Supreme Court, the possibility of the
está prejudicada, pelo que o senhor diz.
Removal of this veto is harmed in some way. Well, I believe that what is presented in the reasons for the overthrowing of this veto is enough for the government to be careful in this implementation. And there is an agreement in the TCU mentioning that in the approval of the accounts in the previous government, that it would be the obligation of the government to monitor the budget implementation and verify the possibility of its application. So it's not about the simple fact of that it was an initiative from the executive power with the voting or pre-approval of a project. That this would exempt them from actually protecting or preserving the fiscal responsibility law and also the application of the tax legal code. So we must have clarity that the control agencies are more and more interested on how and saying how the executive power should operate, and this kind of invasion and competence levels will generate some kind of situation, a complex situation, which does not exempt the government from the responsibility of implementing what was actually decided upon. Leader, since you've mentioned the TCU, I would like you to please talk about the decision from the TCU last week about the payment of amounts payable. You talked about the issue with the apagão das canetas, with this excessive vigilance from these control agencies that were avoiding the government of even making doing politics. And I would like you to give us your interpretation on this decision from the TCU, because technically speaking, I say that nothing really changed. The TCU just reaffirmed something that was done in all of the previous years. Last decade, where you can transfer to the next year the payment of amounts payable at a certain volume, but there is an interpretation that this could increase the political pressure to maybe have the issuance of extraordinary credits for the payment of other expenses in the next year, and even the COVID voucher. So even amounts payable within the budget. How can you interpret this politically? Well, when I talk about the apagão das canetas, I'm talking about the political activism of the judicial power and the control agencies. I'm not talking about technical teams from the TCU that do not like the law of the differentiated regime and think that the 866 law. So when the government adopts this kind of a differentiated regime that's present in the law, they create any kind of challenge or possible difficulty and problems to demonstrate their lack of satisfaction with the selection or choice from the manager and the public manager. So, and then they lead to they sue this kind of technical person individually. They hire a private lawyer, and we have stability, and so public servers do not need to sign any kind of payment papers to receive their salary. If they don't do anything, they're going to still receive their salary. But if they make subjects attacked, even if they have been acted legally due to a ideological disagreement or conviction from control agencies in the federal, state, or municipal levels, then it's better that they don't sign anything at all. Then we have a paralyzed country because we cannot deliver the benefits that the public budget allows the population to have access to. And this is the main context of the discussion I'm bringing up. So then what happened? The TCU had another observation about how the executive power should take care about the volume of different amounts payable. And then the economy, due to excessive zeal, published a notice 33, saying that these amounts payable could not exist. And then any kind of agreements that were signed now in November, December are going to definitely lead to amounts payable still. So the economy was afraid and interpreted this in an extremist manner and said, look, no one else can sign anything because we can't have these additional amounts payable. And the TCU said, no, we didn't say this. We just said you have to be careful with the volume of amounts payable, and they gave us 1 more year to implement the budget with these amounts payable from 1 year ahead. The government had requested 3 years. So there is a modulation. But anyways, it's clear that there was an excessive zeal in the interpretation of this information of the TCU that would completely paralyze the government, that would not be able to sign any kind of agreement anymore for the credits that we had approved in the House of Representatives, and that would generate some agreements that would definitely lead to amounts payable. I'm going to add on to this because another interpretation that we also had in this episode was that actually it was an internal dispute from the government between Minister Paulo Guedes and Rogério Marinho, and that the winner was actually, after this decision from the TCU, was Minister Rogério Marinho. I would like you to talk about what the situation with Minister Paulo Guedes is like. Is he still very firm as the main guide for the president and the economy? Well, no, we did not have this kind of episode. We certainly had an exaggeration in the interpretation of from the technical team in regards to information from the team for the TCU that lead to this kind of problem with communication 33, notice 33. So Minister Paulo Guedes still has been operating with the Posto Ipiranga, the Ipiranga gas station, with total capacity to produce solutions. Minister Paulo Guedes is the important structure for the financial area of the government, and you know what the government has. You have an accelerator and a brake. All of the minister, like the health, education, regional development, tourism, everyone wants to spend. Social development ministers and the economy needs to regulate the capacity, the budget capacity. So we have permanent conflicts from different positions, and the demands of the municipalities and states impose on the ministries, and the capacity that the public budget actually has to provide these conditions to meet these needs and demands. This exists in the municipalities, in the state governments, and in the union, and this is a permanent debate. Now, there's no point in having power or strength if you do not have the capacity to also really control it and the rhythm and make it stop when necessary. So the economy is the nervous system of the government, and Minister Paulo Guedes has complete trust
aproveitando que a gente já está se encaminhando aqui para as nossas últimas questões, eu queria pegar um tema que o ministro fala com bastante frequência, mas que andou muito pouco dentro do governo e no Congresso também, que são as privatizações. Duas delas, pelo menos, Eletrobras e os Correios, são temas aí, enfim, o mercado acompanha todas elas com atenção, mas essas duas principalmente, acho que um pouco por conta do momento que foi gerado com as falas do ministro, chamaram bastante atenção. Vocês têm perspectiva de que isso, de fato, entre como uma pauta prioritária do governo, ou vai ser mais uma das pautas misturadas aí nessa série de outras agendas que a gente vê, ou de fato o governo vai pegar, colocar esses temas debaixo do braço e trabalhar isso como uma prioridade no ano que vem?
Well, I cannot, I don't have a crystal ball, but if everything works well, from February on, the privatizations will be the priority, and the government really wants to have the biggest amount of privatizations possible. It just really depends on the approval from the House of Representatives, of course, some of them, which are from the mother companies, but the subsidiaries can already privatize with quite a bit of speed, where of course you need to have political desire and willpower and decisions, as well as permissions from the legislative power and from the control agencies. So state-owned companies are corporations of public employees. The TCU is a corporation of public employees. The public prosecutor's office is also a corporation of public employees. So all of these entities, as a form of solidarity, they are very careful, and they provide a lot of suspensions of the process for privatizations because those are their colleagues. that influence this. It's sad, but unfortunately, this is the reality. I would also like to know about the vaccination. The president of the House of Representatives said that the House of Representatives would set on a plan for the acquisition of vaccines with or without the government. And so I wanted to know if what you think the government will do to move on in this sense. The government is waiting for the existence of a vaccine. There's no vaccine approved by Anvisa yet, so the government can't buy any vaccine. I believe that this kind of anxiety or search for trying to move ahead of the government is not helping Brazil in any way. Vaccines for everyone only in 2022. There's no installed production capacity for 2 doses for 8 billion people all over the world. So obviously, this is a matter that must be thought of carefully and very adequately structured so that vaccination can happen in the most economic, efficient, and manner, and favoring the population. All of the vaccines will be released in an emergency approach without the clinical tests of monitoring long-term collateral effects. All of them represent major public health risks, although they produce antibodies, which is the first measure. But if they are going to produce collateral adverse effects in the mid and long term, no one knows. So vaccinating everyone without knowing this is a risk that also needs to be calculated. I hope that we can advance with the transmission. Closed schools are a huge mistake. So we have children and teenagers that won't have symptoms, but once they're contaminated, they can create a huge protection. So I can't believe with bars open and schools closed.
Líder, nossa última questão, eu queria lhe perguntar a opinião sobre outras duas agendas. Não vale dizer que também são prioridade e que vão ser votadas no início do governo sem calendário. Mas é a autonomia do Banco Central, enfim, passou no Senado finalmente, foi enviada à Câmara. Havia até uma perspectiva de que o presidente Rodrigo Maia colocasse para votar ainda esse ano, queria saber como anda. E finalmente a reforma administrativa, o senhor mencionou no início, uma reforma que a Câmara também pressionou bastante o governo a enviar, a reforma foi enviada, mas desde então está guardada ali sem avanço algum. Como é que o governo vai tratar essas duas pautas?
How the government handle these two agendas? The central bank, I hope to vote next week. The administrative reform has significant resistance from the judiciary powers and significant resistance from the left wing. So then it depends. It probably won't happen this year due to this attempt to have support from the left wing to support the secession of the House, the president of the House of Representatives on one side and the other. Since we don't have candidates established, I won't discuss whether this is a problem or not. But even up until now, it's been a problem. And we don't have expectations for the administrative reform for this year. So PLP 137 from Mauro Benevides about the stock fund. Do you think this will be approved this week? It's on the agenda today. It's the next item in the agenda for today. And PLP 101 is also an urgent matter that's already being discussed in the agenda, and then we can. So those 5 topics that I had agreed upon with President Bolsonaro on the 11th of November, 4 have already been included in the agenda, and the central bank will be included for
Deputado
next
Ricardo
week.
Barros, líder do governo na Câmara, muito obrigado pela sua participação. Júnior, obrigado por ter feito esse painel e essa conversa comigo. Agradeço a todos que nos acompanharam também e devolvo a palavra para a Raquel e para a Clara. Obrigado, boa noite.
And Clara, thank you very much. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much. Good evening. Well, thank you all speakers that are leaving. It was an excellent session, just as all of the other ones. So we're finishing this first afternoon/evening that we had with a lot of content and information. And we're taking a quick summary of what we've seen today. In the first panel, we talked about the vision from XP with our chief economist and our chief of political analysis of what we're seeing for 2021. It's going to be a very difficult year with many challenges, but nothing is 100% defined. We still have a lot of questions about what could be potentially positive because we can move towards a perspective that is more careful, but not necessarily pessimist for next year, especially if we take a look at the economic recovery will continue with a fiscal risk as the main barrier. And that's why it's so important to understand the political scenario and the main developments of all of this in the economy and markets. In the second panel, we also talked about monetary policy, fiscal policy, expectations for growth in the long run, international commerce, productivity. So it was a very complete agenda that was very full, a full menu about the economy and markets, a real in-depth class with special guests like Arminio Fraga. And we also had, which is the main message that I heard, which is really the markets talking about challenges and opportunities for investments in the global scenario and domestic scenario. And I think the main message is being careful and having a diversified portfolio which are keywords for the next year. Then in the third panel, we also discussed the importance of the tax reform for the economy. We brought 3 major specialists about this topic, and each one had a different perspective, which brought in a lot of richness and details, although we did have some different opinions about how the reform should happen and what should be the ideal transition period, what is the size of this. This reform is essential. The tax reform is essential. The debate in Brazil is a lot more heated, and we should expect some advances in this agenda for next year. And finally, we entered the political context with one of the main players of the political scenario, the government leader in the House of Representatives, which Junia and Paulo brought and shared this dialogue. And he brought a bit of panorama about the political alliances and fiscal matters that are extremely important that we discussed in all the other panels, such as the approval of the emergency constitutional amendment and even the budget law, and as well as a state vision, a political state policy versus government policy perspective. It was very interesting to observe, and the alignment with the economic team, such as the autonomy of the central bank and the privatizations, which according to Representative Ricardo Barros should advance in next year. So this is it for today. A lot of content. And I hope that all of this information, as well as since it really helped us to set up our scenario, also help you to at least have more of a guidance for the next year of 2021. Tomorrow we will have a day to take on all of this baggage to talk about investments. So we have a very, very full panel with investment specialists. We're going to talk about fixed income, shares, stocks, international investments, and you can monitor the entire agenda on our website where you've seen this. And having said this, I'd like to invite you all to help us to really build all of these events better, and passing on your feedback and the QR code that appears on your screen. And you are all going to be directed and you can contribute to our next events, because the most important is that everyone should be building together. I'll see you tomorrow. And I'm already excited for all the specialists I'm going to learn with tomorrow. Thank you very much and good evening to all.